Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin.
There's a town nestled deep in the woods where the wind howls at night and shadows stretch longer than they should. It's the kind of place where time seems to move slower, like the gears of an old clock left to rust. The people who live there are quiet, simple folk who spend their days tending to their gardens or taking the occasional stroll along the winding, cracked roads. But the one thing that has kept them up at night for generations is the old mansion at the edge of town. They call it the Greystone Mansion, though it's been decades since anyone has seen the place in anything close to decent condition. The windows are blacked out, the roof sagging under the weight of years, and the wood is weathered, turning to an ashen gray that mirrors the name. But it's not the mansion's decaying appearance that gives people pause. No, it's the sound that comes every night, right at midnight, without fail. The townspeople say it's the rattling of chains, long, heavy chains dragged across the floor of the mansion, echoing through the trees and drifting across the fields. The sound starts out faint, like whispers on the wind, but it grows louder until it sounds like something is struggling, trapped, desperate to escape. The children are told to be in bed by 9, not because it's their bedtime, but because that's when the chains begin. The older folk, those who have lived in the town their whole lives, don't even speak of it anymore. They just glance toward the mansion, then back at the ground, muttering under their breath. Some say it's the ghost of an old man, his spirit bound to the mansion by a curse. Others talk about the tragic story of a young woman who was chained to the wall in the cellar, left to die by someone who had once promised to love her. But the most popular story, the one that everyone whispers about but is afraid to truly believe, it's that of a man who was trapped in the house, his spirit forever caught between life and death, dragging chains across the floor as he searches for a way out. Still, no one dares to go near the place. It's easier to pretend the legends are just that, stories passed down over generations to frighten children, to keep them from straying too far into the woods. Until Will Jensen arrived. Will was the kind of guy who prided himself on skepticism. He had heard the legends, of course. He'd heard them all his life, growing up in the town just a few miles away. But to him, ghosts were just tricks of the mind, a way for people to explain the unexplainable. He'd seen too many horror movies to believe that anything supernatural could be real. All those stories, just folklore, nothing more. When Will drove into town to visit his childhood friend, Mark, the first thing he was told as they sat in the dimly lit bar on Main Street was about the rattling chains. It was, after all, the one thing everyone in town could agree on. "Oh, you've heard the stories, right?" Mark said, leaning back in his chair, a half-smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had that kind of look about him, someone who believed in things that went bump in the night, but wasn't going to admit it outright. Rattling chains? Will raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his beer. I'm guessing this is the part where you tell me I should go see for myself. He swallowed hard, trying to calm his nerves, but there was no shaking the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, watching him, waiting. He felt the flashlight tremble in his hand, as if it, too, understood the danger that surrounded him. Then came another sound, a groan, deep and low, like the house was shifting on its foundation. The floor creaked beneath him, and his flashlight beam flickered again, the light wavering, dancing across the walls in disorienting patterns. The chains. They weren't rattling anymore. They were dragging closer, right behind him. Will's breath hitched as he turned sharply, his eyes darting to the hallway, but there was nothing there, not a soul, no flicker of a shadow, just the echo of those chains, louder, more insistent now. They weren't behind him anymore. They were beside him, and the whispering. It was growing louder. Come closer. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the doorframe. His heart thundered in his chest. He had to get out. Now. But the door, the one he had just entered through, wasn't where it had been before. It was no longer open. The door stood firmly shut, the frame solid and unyielding, as if it had never been touched. Will's mind raced. The rational part of him screamed that this had to be some kind of trick, that it had to be an illusion, something to unsettle him, to play on his fears. But he couldn't deny the reality of what he was hearing, what he was feeling. The chains, the whispering, the suffocating weight of the house pressing in on him from every side. Come closer. It's time. He whirled around, his flashlight beam sweeping the room in a frantic search for an escape. The chains, they were everywhere now. The dragging, relentless sound was everywhere, closing in on him. He couldn't even tell where it was coming from anymore. The air was thick, choking with the sound. And the whispering, the voice, it was no longer a whisper. It was a command. It's time for you to stay. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he ran toward the nearest door, his pulse thrumming against the walls of his skull. His hand grasped the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The door was locked. The chains rattled louder than ever. Don't fight it. You can't leave. You never will. Suddenly, the light from the flashlight flickered and died. For a moment, Will was thrown into complete darkness, and then a figure appeared in front of him. Not a man, not a woman, something in between. A face, pale and gaunt, with eyes that glowed in a natural yellow, its features distorted by the shadows. The chains that were dragging across the floor, were attached to this figure, wrapped around its body. And as it moved, those chains rattled violently, pulling, dragging, ever closer. Will's breath caught in his throat, his legs frozen, and as the figure drew nearer, the chains clanged louder than they ever had before. And then the voice. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream. The moment Will saw the figure, his mind locked up. It was like staring into the abyss of something he couldn't understand, a place so far beyond the logical confines of his reality that every muscle in his body screamed for him to run. But his feet were leaden, heavy as stone. Every instinct told him to flee, but he couldn't. The dark, suffocating air pressed in on him, pinning him to the spot. The chains rattled louder now, a thunderous, unforgiving noise, as though the very walls of the mansion were shuddering under the weight of whatever the figure represented. The chains were no longer just dragging. They were pulling, snapping in time with the figure's slow, deliberate movements. The thing was real. It was tangible. And it was right in front of him. Will's eyes locked onto the figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form skeletal, gaunt. Its face was a mask of pale, waxy skin, stretched tight over bone, with two glowing yellow eyes that burned through the darkness like tiny, burning stars. The chains seemed to come from all directions, clinking and rattling, draping over its shoulders, wrapped around its torso, its limbs. They connected to it as though they were a part of it, not something dragging behind, but something that was pulling with it. And the smell. It hit him all at once. Decay. Rot. Like something dead, something old and forgotten that had been trapped in this place for too long. The stench clung to the air, thick and sour, clogging his throat and making it impossible to breathe normally. Will's chest constricted as he forced a breath in, his body shaking from the effort. He wanted to look away, to turn and flee, but he couldn't. The eyes, the yellow eyes, held him. Not with a physical grip, but with something far worse. It was as though the figure was pulling at the very core of his being, drawing out his thoughts, his fears, one by one, until there was nothing left but the terror of the moment. It took another slow step forward. The chains dragged across the floor, a terrible screeching sound that grated against Will's skull like nails on a chalkboard. And then the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice like any he had ever heard. It wasn't the voice of a man or a woman. It wasn't even the voice of something human. It was guttural, like the sound of stone grinding against stone, ancient and hollow. "You should not have come here," it rasped, its voice filling the room, echoing off the walls and vibrating deep in Will's chest. The words weren't a warning. They were an accusation. Will tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He opened his mouth and croaked, the only sound a strangled gasp. His mind spun, racing to make sense of the nightmare he was trapped in. I didn't," he stammered, his voice weak, barely a whisper. "It's just a story, right?" The thing didn't respond at first. Instead, it moved closer, and with each step, the chains dragged louder, more violently. Will could feel the pressure building in the room, a weight that seemed to squeeze at his chest, his lungs. His heart was hammering against his ribs as though it too was trying to escape, to free itself from the vice grip of fear that had seized him. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. It wasn't a fast movement. In fact, it was painfully slow, like the thing was savoring the moment. Will's eyes widened as the chains rattled again. Closer, closer still. He backed up, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in this room with the figure, the chains, the thing that had come for him. It stopped just inches from him, and Will could feel the cold radiating from its body, from the chains that coiled around it like a suffocating snake. He could smell it now, even more strongly. The rot, the decay, the centuries of dust and abandonment. The figure's mouth opened. The sound that came from it wasn't a voice, but a screech, high-pitched and piercing, like metal grinding against metal. Will flinched, covering his ears, but the noise cut through him anyway, vibrating in his very bones. "You are here because you chose to be," it hissed, its voice a sickening mixture of gravel and blood. The chains behind it rattled again, as though they were answering its command, pulling taut. Will's mind spun, trying desperately to understand what was happening. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came. The words from the figure, "You are here because you chose to be," echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again, a cruel mantra that twisted in his gut. What did it mean? Why had he chosen this? Why had he come to this place? And then, as if on cue, the chains jerked violently, wrapping themselves around his legs with a strength that made him stumble. He tried to break free, to fight against them, but they tightened, constricting, and with each pull, the chains seemed to drag him deeper into the room. His legs buckled, and he fell to his knees, the cold, hard floor beneath him, like ice. The figure loomed over him, its yellow eyes burning into him, unblinking, relentless. "You should have listened," the figure whispered now, and Will could feel its breath against his face, cold and foul. It smelled like death. "But it's too late. You belong to me now." A cold, violent shiver ran through Will's spine, his hands clutching at the chains around his legs, desperate to pull them off. But it was no use. The chains weren't just physical. They were something else, something older, something that seemed to crawl into his skin, into his mind, binding him in ways that were impossible to fight. Suddenly, the chains loosened, not by much, but enough to allow him to stand, shakily, his heart racing. He staggered to his feet, barely able to keep his balance as he swayed, dazed and disoriented. He looked around, desperate for any sign of an escape, but the mansion was an endless void. Every door was locked, every window sealed shut. He could hear the chains again, this time in the distance. They were dragging, pulling, but they weren't coming from the figure anymore. They were coming from all directions, growing closer, rattling through the house, closing in on him. It was then that he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the dark shadows, a faint light flickered. He couldn't make out what it was, just a glimmer of movement, a small wisp of pale light. His breath caught in his throat, and he knew without thinking that it was his only chance. He ran, but the chains, those damn chains, were everywhere. They clanged, they snapped, they dragged, pulling him backward, holding him in place. He could feel them tightening around his chest, around his wrists. But still, he pushed forward, his feet slipping on the cold floor. Closer, the light, closer. The chains pulled tighter, and then, just as Will reached the doorway, he stopped, because he saw it. Behind him, not the figure, but something else. A face in the dark. Will's breath froze in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the weight of the air pressing down on him or the shock of seeing the face, but his heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the thing in the room with him. That thing, that creature with the chains wrapped around its skeletal form, was still lingering in the shadows ahead, its yellow eyes burning like twin suns. But this was something else. The face. It wasn't a face that belonged to the creature. No, this was a face that belonged to the walls, to the darkness, to the mansion itself. It was a face he knew. The pale skin, the hollow eyes, those were familiar features. But it wasn't just a face. It was his own face, a twisted reflection of himself, distorted and pressed into the shadows of the hallway, staring back at him with a hollow gaze that held no recognition, no warmth, just cold, lifeless eyes that seemed to pull him closer. The face was too close, too intimate, its lips barely moving as if it had something to say. Will's body went rigid. He couldn't move. His feet were frozen to the floor, his legs useless beneath him. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to run, but it wasn't like before. Now the chains weren't just rattling. They were singing a dreadful lullaby in his ears, wrapping around him with a rhythmic pull, almost gentle, as though coaxing him closer to the thing, closer to the face. His hand trembled as he reached for the light, but it was too far. too far gone. The flickering glow of whatever was drawing him forward beckoned in the darkness. It was the only thing that seemed alive in this suffocating tomb of a house. The air tasted like dust and despair. The cold was creeping deeper into his bones, his joints seizing up with every passing second. He couldn't let it get him. He couldn't let that thing behind him have him. But the face, it moved again. It wasn't his reflection anymore. It had changed. The face was stretching, distorting, growing. The hollow eyes seemed to widen, to pull the sockets open wider and wider, until it looked like the face was going to swallow him whole. Will's breath came faster, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as his own reflection shifted and twisted into something that was not human. You are here because you chose to be. The voice came from the face now, that same guttural rasp, but now it was sharper, closer. Will didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe it, but he could feel the truth in those words, the way they sank into his skull, piercing through his thoughts. He was stuck. He was trapped. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. All he could do was stand there, his mind locked in a vice, unable to escape from the horror unfolding before him. The figure in the shadows, the one wrapped in chains, stepped forward now. Will could feel it drawing closer, but it wasn't in any rush. It moved slowly, deliberately, its chains clinking with every shift of its body, as though the rattling was part of its ritual. The chains, they were everywhere now. Will couldn't see them, but he could feel them, gripping his chest, pulling at his arms, dragging him toward the figure. It was like the chains were part of the house itself, part of the very bones of Greystone Mansion. They were in the walls, in the floors, in the air he breathed. It was as though they were trying to consume him, to drag him into the same endless loop of terror that had trapped whoever, whatever, had been here before. And then, just as the figure reached him, as Will's knees gave out and he collapsed to the floor, the chains stopped. The room went silent. The whispering ceased. For one horrifying moment, Will was left in the stillness, the heavy air pressing on him like a tombstone. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening, as if the very weight of the house had placed its hands around his ribcage. He blinked rapidly, disoriented, trying to clear his vision, to make sense of the nightmarish scene. The figure was standing still, its chains draped like a shroud around it, but it didn't move. Its yellow eyes glowed with a predatory patience, studying him. And the thing, whatever it was waiting for him to break. And then it happened. The chains moved again, not in the slow, deliberate way they had before. They were snapping now, jerking, as though they had minds of their own. They coiled around Will's legs, dragging him backward across the cold floor, pulling him into the deeper recesses of the house. No! Will tried to fight. His legs kicked out, his hands grasped at the chains, but they were unyielding, like iron, like steel, unbreakable. Every pull dragged him closer to the heart of the mansion, deeper into its bowels. The further he was pulled, the more the walls seemed to close in on him, tightening like a vice, until he could no longer see the hallway, the doorway, the pale reflection of himself. His hands were slick with sweat now, his heart hammering in his chest as the chains pulled him down into the darkness, deeper, farther, and the face, that twisted reflection of his own self, seemed to follow him, a constant, maddening presence, its hollow eyes burning into his mind. The face was everywhere now, in the walls, in the floor, in the ceiling. It was all around him. Will's fingers brushed against the cold, damp stone of the mansion's walls, but it did nothing to slow his descent. It was as though the house had its claws in him, pulling him into its very core. But just as quickly as the chains had pulled him, they stopped. The room around him had shifted. It was no longer the hallway, no longer the place he had seen moments ago. No, now he was in a small, dark room. The only light was a dim, sickly glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, bathing the space in a ghastly hue. The chains were gone. Will blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of what was happening. His body felt heavy, sluggish, like he had been drugged, his limbs slow to obey his commands. But his mind, the sharpness of it, was still there. The fear was still there, deep inside of him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He raised his head, his eyes searching the dark corners of the room, and that's when he saw it. The door. It was in front of him now, just a few steps away. The light flickered once, twice, and he knew this was his chance. This was it. He had to go. He had to get out of here. But when his hand touched the doorknob, it was as if the world around him shifted again. A voice, cold, unfeeling, whispered in his ear, "It's too late to leave." Will's hand was still on the doorknob. He could feel its smooth, worn surface beneath his fingertips, a small tether to the world beyond this place, this house, this nightmare. The voice that had whispered in his ear, cold and uncaring, hung in the air like a curse, and for a fleeting moment Will thought he might lose himself completely. He could feel the walls closing in again, the chains, the darkness, everything pressing against him, threatening to swallow him whole. It's too late to leave, but he couldn't stop now. He had come too far. He had witnessed too much. The fear had taken root in his chest, but the need to survive had become something stronger, something raw and primal. He wasn't going to die here, not in this forsaken house, not like this. He pushed against the door, the wood creaking in protest. The space behind it seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, as though the mansion itself was mocking him, making promises of freedom it would never keep. Still, he shoved harder, throwing his weight against it with all the strength he could muster. His shoulder slammed into the doorframe, the sound echoing through the room. It felt real, like a victory, a small moment of defiance against the suffocating forces that had already claimed too much of his soul. And then, just as quickly as the door had moved, it stopped. It didn't open. Will stepped back, his chest heaving with each desperate breath. The air was thick, suffocating, as though it had weight, pressure, a presence of its own. His heart raced faster, his mind unraveling with every second that passed. There was something wrong with this place, something he couldn't explain. The chains, the whispers, they weren't just physical. No, they were part of the very fabric of the house itself. And the house, as he had learned, wanted something from him. It had drawn him in with promises of mystery, of adventure, and now it was pulling him into its depths, trapping him in a never-ending cycle of terror. He stepped away from the door, shaking, and turned toward the rest of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, reaching, crawling, as though the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting. In the center of the room, the pale glow of the light flickered one last time, just a brief flash of illumination that was gone before he could even take a breath. And then, through the suffocating silence, He heard it again. The chains. But this time, they weren't distant. They weren't dragging across the floor. They were inside the walls, inside his mind. Click. A soft, metallic snap. Then another. A drag. Another click. The chains were everywhere, tightening, constricting. It was as if they were growing, multiplying, becoming part of him. Will stumbled backward, his hands reaching for anything to hold on to, but the air was too thick, the darkness too deep. His fingers brushed against something cold and wet. A wall? A floor? The edges of his sanity? It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The chains were pulling him in, whispering his name, urging him to fall into their embrace. You belong to us now. The voice didn't come from the figure anymore, or from the reflection. Number It came from everywhere, from the walls, the chains, the very ground beneath his feet. It was part of the house. It was part of everything. Will turned, his legs barely holding him upright, and faced the center of the room. There was a shape there, a shifting darkness, something that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The chains. They were inside it, winding, coiling, pulling. The figure in the shadows, if it could even be called a figure, was growing, changing. The chains weren't just an accessory anymore. They were its flesh. The thing had become the chains. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure lifted its head. Will saw its face. No, its faces, 1,000 twisted reflections of himself, each one shifting and warping, moving in ways that were not natural, not human. His own face, but not his face. Each expression, each flicker of emotion, twisted into something dark, something unrecognizable. And then, from within the darkness, the chains moved again. They weren't rattling this time. They were reaching. They lashed out, snapping forward like serpents, hunting their prey, their metallic length stretching toward him, pulling him, dragging him into the heart of the darkness. Will couldn't scream. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The fear was too overwhelming, too consuming. The chains were everywhere now, surrounding him, suffocating him. They coiled around his chest, around his arms, his legs, dragging him closer to the thing that had once been a man, to the creature that was now a part of the very house itself. And as they pulled him closer, the darkness in the room deepened. The faces, his faces, reached toward him, eyes empty, hollow, yet full of something. They were mocking him now, laughing perhaps, or crying. Will couldn't tell. He could no longer tell the difference. The chains tightened. They were everywhere, inside him. They wrapped around his mind, his soul, his very being, and for the first time, he understood. This house didn't want his body. Number It had already taken that. It wanted something much worse. It wanted his soul. His vision blurred as the darkness closed in around him. The chains were pulling him deeper into the abyss, farther away from the world he had known. His limbs became numb, his chest cold, suffocating. He could feel himself being swallowed whole by the house. There would be no escape. There was no way out. Not now. Not ever. You will never leave. The chains whispered. They weren't just words. They were the truth, the reality, the promise. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Will felt his body fall, as though it was no longer his. He hit the ground hard, his breath ragged and shallow, his chest barely moving. The chains were gone. The dark room had vanished. The mansion itself seemed to dissolve into a void, leaving only an empty, suffocating silence. He was no longer in the house. He was no longer anywhere. He had become part of the chains. And somewhere, deep in the mansion's heart, a door creaked open, but no one was left to hear it. There's something about the late hours that twists the world. The shadows grow long, and the air becomes thick with secrets. It's a feeling you don't notice at first, like when you walk into a room and someone's been standing behind you, just a little too long. But as the clock ticks closer to midnight, the quiet whispers begin to take shape. And that's when you realize something's been following you. That was how it started for Nathaniel, though he didn't know it at the time. It was just another night. He had worked late again, that cruel grind of a 9 to 5 that ate away at the hours and the years. The city was quiet, quieter than usual for a Wednesday night, and Nathaniel was glad for the solitude. He liked walking home after his shifts, the cool air brushing against his face as the street stretched out before him, empty and waiting. No one to bother him, no one to ask about his day or remind him of things he didn't care to think about. It was the only time his mind could wander freely, bouncing between the mundane and the weird, without the weight of responsibility. As he walked down Oakwood Street, past the dimly lit shop windows and old creaking buildings, a faint sound tickled his ears. A footstep? No, not quite. It was softer, more fluid, like someone gliding rather than walking. At first, Nathaniel thought little of it. The streets were hardly ever empty, and someone was probably walking a little faster behind him, trying to catch up. He could hear the faint shuffle of shoes, the scraping of soles against the pavement, but it didn't seem strange at first. And then he heard it again, a slow, deliberate step, closer this time. Nathaniel's instincts stirred, but he pushed it down. Just a coincidence. Maybe someone was walking the same way. His pace quickened just a fraction. He tried to dismiss the feeling creeping along his spine, that nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, something wasn't right. His footsteps echoed louder now, matching his quickening pace, but the sound behind him was getting closer, keeping perfect rhythm with him, as if it was walking just a little too closely, matching his stride with uncanny precision. He glanced over his shoulder, trying to be nonchalant. There, in the distance, just at the edge of the lamplight, a figure stood. Its silhouette was dark, looming. It wasn't exactly threatening, just a man, maybe, wrapped in a heavy coat, the hood pulled low. But something about the way it stood there, unmoving, felt off, like it didn't belong. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. He tried to brush it off. It was late. People were out and about at odd hours. He gave the figure a passing glance and turned forward again, but his skin was crawling, a tickling unease spreading through him. The figure stayed where it was, watching. Nathaniel's pace slowed. Maybe I'm just tired, he thought, or maybe it's nothing. He felt a shift in the air, like a change that he couldn't put his finger on. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as the figure seemed to come closer, not walking, but gliding forward. There was a fluidity to it, as though the person, if it was even a person, wasn't touching the ground at all. His breath caught in his throat. That was when it hit him. He wasn't alone. The figure moved, just a fraction, but enough to break the stillness between them. Nathaniel's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, trying to catch a glimpse of the face beneath the hood, but it was too dark. The figure had disappeared, slipping back into the shadows. Nathaniel stopped, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He turned around fully now, peering into the emptiness behind him, but there was no one there. No sound of footsteps, no shift of weight in the air. The street was empty. He exhaled, relief flooding him in a way that was almost embarrassing. "It's nothing," he told himself, "just my imagination." But the unease didn't leave him. There was still something hanging in the air, a weight that pressed against him like a heavy fog. Nathaniel turned back around and started walking again, but his pace was slower this time. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. His eyes darted from side to side, every shadow seeming to stretch longer than it should, every corner darker than the last. As the minutes ticked by, the feeling only grew stronger. There was something lurking just outside the perimeter of his vision, something wrong. He was certain of it now. There it was again, that faint sound, the soft scrape of footsteps, too deliberate, too precise. He stopped again, unwilling to look behind him. Nathaniel's heart raced in his chest, his body tensing in anticipation. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and then silence. Nathaniel stood frozen. He was sure he could feel it now, the presence, the weight of something unnatural behind him. It wasn't just the sound of footsteps, number. It was the sound of something else, something inhuman, something that didn't belong. Slowly, he turned around, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. And there it was, the figure, this time closer than before. The black hood obscured its face, but even from this distance, Nathaniel could see the outlines of a body, tall, slender, cloaked in black. The air around it seemed to bend, like the space was shifting in response to its presence. He could see nothing beneath the hood, just a darkness that swirled like a void. Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure didn't move. It didn't step forward. It simply watched. A deep, primal fear lodged itself in Nathaniel's throat. He felt as though he were suffocating, trapped in a moment where every second stretched into eternity. There was something horribly wrong with that figure. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But he felt it. And then, just like before, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness. No sound of retreating footsteps, no sign of motion. It was as if it had never been there at all. Nathaniel stood still, his body rigid, heart beating so hard it felt like it would break through his ribs. He didn't move for a long time. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen. Was it real? Had he imagined it? Maybe it was just the fatigue, the exhaustion creeping in after a long day of work. But deep down, he knew. He knew that wasn't just his imagination. This was something else, something wrong. He swallowed hard, taking in the cold air around him, trying to steady himself. And then, with a deep breath, he turned back around and began walking, his footsteps louder now, almost frantic. The figure was still out there. He could feel it, like a weight on his back, stalking him through the streets. But for now, Nathaniel was too scared to look back again. He just had to keep moving. Just one more step until he was home, safe. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next night, Nathaniel didn't want to walk home. He was tired, worn out from another long day at the office, and his mind was clouded with thoughts of what he had seen. The figure, the black-hooded thing, had haunted his thoughts since the moment he'd shut his front door behind him. He had tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, that he was just overworked, and running on fumes. Maybe it was just a man on his way home too. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. It sat like a weight on his chest. The figure. It wasn't just the shape of a man, was it? No, it felt wrong, unnatural, like something that had slipped through from another place, something that was only almost human. Still, as the evening wore on, the sky turned dark, and the stars slowly blinked into place. Nathaniel couldn't escape the inevitable. He had to walk home. There was no other choice. The bus had stopped running earlier, and though he had thought about taking a cab, the sting of the price kept him from calling one. It was a small rebellion, a way of holding on to the semblance of control, the illusion of choice. He stepped out onto the street again, but this time it felt different. The night was quiet, too quiet, as if the world had decided to hold its breath. The usual sounds of traffic and distant chatter were muffled, the streets emptier than he had remembered. The air felt heavy, thick, and a small part of him wondered if it was just his own nerves making everything seem more oppressive than it was. Still, he walked faster than usual, his eyes darting left and right, unwilling to give in to the fear gnawing at him from the inside. By the time he reached Oakwood Street, his thoughts were like static, jumbled and disjointed, afraid to focus on any one thing. Just walk, just get home. His footsteps echoed in the silent streets. The faint rustling of the trees overhead did little to drown out the pounding in his chest, the cold sweat prickling his neck. And then, there it was again, a soft scrape. His heart jumped in his chest. Nathaniel froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, listening, trying to decipher what he was hearing. The sound was almost familiar now, like a sickly echo of something wrong. Another scrape, closer, closer than it had been before. Nathaniel swallowed hard. His first instinct was to run, to turn and flee. But he didn't. Not yet. He wanted to see it again, wanted to prove to himself that it wasn't some product of his imagination, that the thing following him wasn't real. If he could just turn around, look it in the face, maybe then it would be over. He spun around, heart in his throat, eyes wide, and there it was, the figure, cloaked in black, standing a few feet behind him, its face hidden beneath the hood. Its posture was strange, wrong, rigid, and unnatural, like a mannequin posed in the wrong position, a mere suggestion of a body that was somehow more alive than it should be. Nathaniel couldn't breathe. It was too close this time. He could feel it, an unnatural weight pressing down on him, the air thickening, suffocating him. And it wasn't just the figure itself. No, it was the presence, something that was far worse than just a man in a hood. It was as if the figure was pulling at the air around it, bending space, creating a vacuum that sucked the warmth from the world. The sound of those footsteps, the scraping, gliding sound, came again, and this time Nathaniel could feel it in his bones, vibrating through the ground beneath him. He couldn't tell if it was the figure moving or if it was simply there with him. He blinked, and the thing hadn't moved, but it was so close now, its presence like a weight on his chest, pushing him to the ground. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey him. He stood there, rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness beneath the hood. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, standing in front of him, and the next it was gone. No trace of it in the street, no sound of retreating footsteps. Nathaniel's breath came in sharp gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen, trembling, trying to grasp at some shred of sanity. But it was gone, gone, like a dream slipping through his fingers the moment he tried to hold on to it. What the hell is happening? The fear clutched at him, but he shook it off, forced himself to move. His legs felt like lead, but he pushed himself forward. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop. But as he walked, the thoughts didn't stop. His mind raced, twisting and turning over the events of the night. It wasn't just the figure. It was how it had appeared, how it had moved, if it had even moved at all. It had glided, slipped through the shadows like it was part of them. But even more unsettling was the fact that it hadn't moved toward him. It had simply followed. And that's when it clicked. Nathaniel stopped dead in his tracks, his body seizing as the truth hit him like a cold slap to the face. The thing wasn't just a random occurrence. It was following him every night. Every time he walked home, it was there. The scraping footsteps, the black hood. It wasn't just a one-time thing, some freak encounter. No, this was a pattern that had already begun. He had seen it before, hadn't he? Not in the same way, not so close, but there had been moments, flickers of movement in the corner of his eye, the unsettling sensation of being watched. It wasn't just coincidence. The figure had been following him for weeks. Nathaniel's pulse quickened as the fear turned to something darker, something more primal. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. This wasn't going to stop. And then, almost as if the thought had summoned it, he heard it again, the soft scrape, closer than ever. Nathaniel had never been one for superstition. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't put stock in old wives' tales or haunted houses. He liked facts, clear, clean, logical. But logic had done nothing to explain the events of the last few nights. The figure, the hooded thing, following him in silence, growing closer each time. It wasn't just his imagination. He couldn't chalk it up to fatigue or paranoia anymore. This wasn't some figment of his mind. It was real, and getting closer. That third night, the unease was a constant ache in his chest. Nathaniel tried to focus on work, tried to ignore the chill creeping over him every time he thought of Oakwood Street. But as the clock ticked toward 9 p.m., the dread began to settle in his gut, weighing him down. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen, that tonight was going to be different. Still, he left work on time, just as he did every night. The steady thrum of the city was still there, but something was off. The air felt heavy, and the streetlights flickered in a way that made him glance up, wondering if something was wrong with the power. He'd been walking home every night for months, but tonight it felt different. He took his usual route, his footsteps a little too loud against the quiet hum of the night. His eyes darted left, then right, searching for the shadow at the corner of his vision. He tried to tell himself he was being stupid, that he was simply being overcautious, that the hooded figure was just a coincidence. But the closer he got to Oakwood, the more he felt the cold breath of something behind him. And then, there it was again, the scrape of footsteps, too soft to be a normal step, too deliberate to be random. He stopped, his body rigid with tension, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he was paralyzed. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to know what was behind him. But there was no ignoring it now. The coldness in the air had thickened, almost as if it had been sucked into a vacuum. and the presence that lingered just beyond his reach felt like an iron weight pulling at him, drawing him deeper into the night. He turned. The figure was standing in the same place it had been the night before, only this time it was closer, much closer. The hood still obscured its face, but Nathaniel could see its form now, could see the way it stood, its posture too stiff, too deliberate, as if it were frozen in time, waiting for him to make the next move. His heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't look away. The figure was there, standing in the exact same spot as before, but this time the air felt different. It wasn't just the sense of being watched. It was something else entirely. A subtle shift, as if the world had bent in on itself, and the street around him no longer felt like his own. It was as though the figure existed in a place beyond his perception, something that was too dark and too wrong to fit into the world as he knew it. Nathaniel's mouth went dry. He wanted to run, wanted to turn on his heel and flee, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then the figure took a step forward, slow, measured, unhurried, but the space between them closed, inch by inch, as if time itself had been stretched like taffy. The figure didn't walk. It glided, its feet never seeming to make contact with the ground, just hovering over the pavement in an unsettling, fluid motion. It didn't need to hurry. It knew it had all the time in the world. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but the world around him seemed to narrow. The streetlights flickered again, and a sharp chill shot through him, freezing him in place. The figure came closer until it was standing just a few feet away, its dark, hooded form looming over him. Nathaniel could feel the presence now, a suffocating weight that pressed down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. Who are you?" His voice cracked, barely a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Instead, it raised a hand, long, thin fingers emerging from the folds of its cloak, and pointed directly at him. The motion was slow, unnaturally so, and for a moment Nathaniel felt like he was staring into the eyes of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The air thickened. The sound of the city, the distant hum of life, faded into a heavy silence. "It's not real," Nathaniel thought desperately. "It's not real. It's just my mind playing tricks. It's—" But before he could finish the thought, the figure vanished, not in a burst of motion, not in a flash of shadows, but in an impossible stillness. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. No trace, no footsteps, no rustling of clothing, just nothing. Nathaniel's body snapped back into motion. He didn't even think about it. His feet moved on their own, and he was running as fast as he could, heart hammering in his chest, lungs burning. He couldn't stop. He couldn't breathe. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to escape, needed to put miles between himself and the figure. It didn't matter where he went. The air was still thick with that oppressive weight, the sense that something was closing in on him, always just behind him. He kept running, his body aching, his mind lost in the madness of it all. Finally, when his legs felt like they would give out, he stopped. He was somewhere near the park now, out of breath, drenched in sweat, his skin clammy and cold. He looked around, expecting the figure to reappear, but there was nothing. The streets were empty. The world was quiet. But even then, Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was watching him. The next morning, Nathaniel's mind raced. He had to make sense of it. He needed to understand why it was happening. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more to this? He couldn't ignore it. The figure was part of a pattern. He was sure of it. The first night, just a fleeting image in the shadows. The second night, closer, but still distant. And now, the third night, it had moved closer still. It wasn't a random occurrence. This thing was following him, waiting for something, waiting for him. Nathaniel could feel it in his bones now. The pattern was unfolding, and whatever it was, it had a purpose. Nathaniel spent the next few days in a haze. His mind wouldn't stop spinning. Every creak of a floorboard in his apartment felt like a warning, every shadow a reminder of what had happened on Oakwood Street. His friends noticed the change. He'd become withdrawn, quiet, more distant. They assumed it was just work stress, that it was nothing. But Nathaniel knew better. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that was beyond his control. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a growing certainty that each night was leading up to something, that this, whatever it was, had a plan. But what was the plan? He tried to convince himself that it was just anxiety, that the figure, the black-hooded thing, was nothing more than a product of his tired, overactive mind. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something wasn't right. Something was following him, and it wasn't going to stop. He had to face it. He had to know what it wanted. By the time the seventh night arrived, Nathaniel had made a decision. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to let fear control him any longer. If the figure had been following him this long, if it had been lurking just beyond his sight all these nights, then tonight would be the night he ended it. He'd made the decision long before the sun began to set. He wasn't going to hide in his apartment like a coward. He wasn't going to let the dark have control over him. He was going to confront whatever it was. The streets were colder than usual that night, the wind biting at his skin as he walked, a deep chill creeping into his bones. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. No, it was the growing anticipation, the weight of what he knew was coming. He could feel it now, in his veins, like a warning. The figure was out there, somewhere, waiting for him. Oakwood Street stretched before him, dark and empty. The city felt distant, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Nathaniel stepped into the shadows of the street, his footsteps muted by the night air. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about the pattern, the way the figure had appeared each night, getting closer, more real, more alive. But tonight, it wasn't going to disappear. Tonight, he was going to face it. And then, just as he'd expected, he heard it, the scrape of footsteps, soft, like a whisper in the night. Too soft to be human, too deliberate to be random. Nathaniel didn't stop. He didn't look back. He kept walking, his eyes straight ahead, his heart racing. His palms were slick with sweat, but he refused to give in to the fear. Not tonight. He had to keep moving. He had to get to the place where he could see the figure in full, face to face, so he could finally understand what it wanted. And then, just as before, the figure appeared. Not in a flash, not in a burst of movement, but slowly, methodically. It stood in the shadows, tall and black, its form indistinct in the dim light. Nathaniel could feel its presence now, that strange weight in the air pressing down on him, the same eerie, suffocating feeling that had been with him since the first night. But this time, it was different. This time, he wasn't going to look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its hood pulled low, obscuring whatever lay beneath. Nathaniel could feel his breath coming in shallow gasps, but he didn't look away. He refused to. "What do you want?" Nathaniel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it rang out in the silence, sharp and trembling. The figure didn't respond. It never did. But then, for the first time, something shifted. The air around Nathaniel grew colder, the shadows deepening. He could feel the figure moving, though it didn't seem to move at all. It was like it was pulling the darkness toward it, drawing the night in around them, twisting the world into something unnatural. A low sound, like the creaking of old wood, filled the air. The figure raised its hand slowly, and for the first time, Nathaniel could see the outline of fingers beneath the cloak. Long, bony fingers, their tips reaching toward him. And that's when he realized it wasn't a person, it wasn't human. The figure was something else. Nathaniel took a step back, instinctively, his heart pounding. But he didn't turn to run. Not yet. The figure took a step toward him, then another, and as it did, the shadows seemed to shift in time with its movements. The scrape of its feet against the pavement was louder now, not a whisper, but a scraping, dragging sound that sent shivers up Nathaniel's spine. And with each step, it grew closer until it was right in front of him, the hood hovering just above his face, blocking his view of whatever lay beneath. It was close now, too close, and Nathaniel could feel the chill emanating from it, as if the figure itself was made of the night. The shadows hung heavy around them, and for the first time, Nathaniel felt the overwhelming weight of its presence. It wasn't just an eerie sensation. It was real. The figure had power that he didn't understand, something that twisted the world around it. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the world, leaving only this thing standing in front of him. Nathaniel tried to move, but his feet wouldn't budge. It was like the ground beneath him had turned to stone, like he was caught in a web of his own terror. And then, just as it had before, the figure raised its hand again, pointing toward him. But this time, it was different. This time, as the figure's finger hovered in the air, a low, almost inaudible sound began to fill the silence. The scrape of chains. The sound was so faint at first that Nathaniel thought it was just his imagination. But then it grew louder, louder still, until it was all around him. Chains, rattling, scraping. From the darkness beyond the figure, chains began to emerge. Long black links that rattled and clinked, dragging across the ground as if someone was pulling them. And in the dim light, Nathaniel saw it. A twisted, broken form, dragging chains behind it, crawling out of the shadows. It wasn't the figure in front of him. It was something worse, something more real than the thing that had been following him. And then Nathaniel understood the pattern, the figure, the seventh encounter. This wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just some shadow. This thing had come for him, and it wasn't leaving without him. Nathaniel's breath stopped. His chest tightened, as though invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. The figure, the thing that had been stalking him for days, was now just a part of the darkness itself. The shadows had come alive, twisting around him, suffocating him. His mind raced, but his body didn't react. His limbs felt numb, frozen in place, as if the world around him had somehow ceased to exist except for the chains, rattling, dragging, pulling toward him. The sound was deafening now, the chains clinking and scraping across the ground, as if they were alive, hungry, waiting for something to take. Nathaniel's heart pounded against his ribs, and his eyes flicked back to the hooded figure. It was still there, hovering, watching. And then, for the first time, he saw its hand move. Slowly, methodically, it reached up, not to the sky, not to the darkness, but directly to him. Nathaniel's chest squeezed tighter. Something told him that this was it, the moment that everything had been leading up to. He had walked this path without understanding, each step drawing him closer to something unspeakable, something ancient. The figure wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just some man. It was a manifestation of something older than the world itself. The thing in the hood wasn't the one who dragged the chains, though. No, the chains were drawn by something else, something worse, something that had been there from the beginning, waiting, hidden beneath the layers of darkness that had gathered around Oakwood Street. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the edges of Nathaniel's mind, as if the shadows themselves were whispering his name. Someone had followed him for days, watching, waiting for him to walk into its trap. But it wasn't just the figure that had been there all along. It was the chains. The chains were part of the curse, part of the reason the figure followed him, because it was bound to him, connected in ways he couldn't possibly understand. And then the chains moved again. The dark form that had been crawling from the shadows was now dragging itself closer, inch by agonizing inch. It was like some grotesque parody of a person, hunched, broken, dragging its weight behind it, one step at a time, dragging the chains as though it had no other purpose than to bring them closer, closer to Nathaniel. He turned, and in that moment, his mind broke. His body surged forward, his feet finally reacting, scrambling for purchase on the pavement. But it was too late. He had known, somewhere deep in his soul, that it had always been too late. The seventh encounter was the final one, the one that sealed his fate. He stumbled backward, breathless, his vision swimming. The chains rattled, growing louder with each passing second, the scraping sound filling his head until it drowned out everything else. He tried to scream, he tried to cry out, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the hollow, cavernous sound that surrounded him. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, his body jerked forward. The chains were pulling him. He didn't know how, didn't know what had happened, but it didn't matter. He was being dragged toward the thing in the hood, dragged closer to the crawling shadow that had been chasing him from the very first night. The figure remained still, its hooded face a blank, empty void. But Nathaniel could feel it now, the presence of something ancient, something dark, wrapping around him like a cold embrace. The chains clinked louder, closer now, scraping against his legs, his arms, his body, each link cold and rough against his skin. They were real. They were here. Nathaniel's heart thundered in his chest as he felt the pull becoming stronger. No matter how hard he fought, no matter how hard he tried to resist, the chains kept dragging him toward the figure. His body was no longer his own. He was being drawn in, pulled into something that wasn't just of this world. And then, as he was just inches away from the black hooded figure, the scraping stopped. The air stilled. The chains fell silent. It was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Nathaniel's eyes locked onto the figure's hood. He could feel his soul being ripped from his body. Was this it? Was this how it ended? His mind raced with all the questions he had never answered. What was this thing? Where did it come from? Why him? But the figure didn't answer. It didn't speak. Instead, the hooded figure slowly raised a hand, fingers long and thin, and gently placed them against Nathaniel's forehead. The touch was cold, colder than ice. It burned with an intensity that made Nathaniel gasp. His body seized up, the cold seeping into his very bones, freezing him from the inside out. The darkness around him grew heavier, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey. And then he saw it. For just a moment, the shadows lifted. The blackness around him seemed to shift, revealing what lay beneath. The figure's face, or what passed for one, was a mask of nothingness, dark, hollow, empty. But there was something behind it, something worse, something that had been lurking, waiting for this moment. A pair of eyes, dark and deep, like the void itself, stared back at him. Eyes that seemed to hold all the answers to questions Nathaniel could never have known to ask. Eyes that were endless, infinite, like they were staring into the very heart of the universe. And in those eyes, he saw the truth. It wasn't just a figure that had been following him. It wasn't just some ghost or spirit, some shadow seeking revenge. It was something older, something that had always been there, waiting, watching. It was the darkness that clung to the world like a sickness, spreading in silence, drawing closer with every step. And the seventh encounter wasn't just the end of Nathaniel's life. It was the beginning of something much darker. The figure's fingers tightened on Nathaniel's forehead, and in that final, unbearable moment, the world around him fractured. The chains, the figure, the night, everything twisted into nothingness. And then, like the final click of a door locking shut, Nathaniel was gone. The street was silent. The chains had stopped rattling. And Oakwood Street stood in the dark, waiting. It started with a ring, a single sharp sound that sliced through the stillness of Thomas's apartment late one Thursday night. The phone, old and heavy, sat next to him on the coffee table, its presence forgotten in the glow of the television. He had been watching the same show for over an hour. Something stupid, something to fill the empty hours after a long day at work. He wasn't paying attention. He wasn't supposed to be. But the ring broke through everything. The way a sound can grab hold of your chest, yank you out of whatever you're doing, and pull you into a different world. Thomas glanced over, surprised to see the landline phone vibrating on the table, its cord dangling loosely off the edge. The name on the caller ID was just a string of numbers, unfamiliar, anonymous. He stared at it for a moment, feeling a cold tug in his gut. He didn't recognize the number, and after years of living alone, he had learned to avoid strange calls at all costs. Too many robocalls, too many sales pitches. He was tempted to let it go to voicemail. But then, as the phone rang again, something shifted. There was an odd weight to the sound, as if the air itself was charged, like the phone call was waiting for something, waiting for him. It felt like it had been building for days, maybe longer. He snatched up the receiver, his fingers suddenly damp. Hello? The voice that came through wasn't a voice at all. It was a hiss, a crackle of static, followed by a low, distorted whisper. A sound that felt like it was being pulled from somewhere deep, somewhere far away. "You're not alone," it whispered. Thomas froze. His heart stuttered. He thought he heard his name, though it wasn't clear, more like a soft hum of syllables, too faint to fully understand. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice coming out sharper than he intended, but the words slipped away, dissolving into the heavy silence that hung between them. The static thickened. The voice was barely there, so quiet it was like listening to a storm on the other side of a door. "Listen, listen carefully, Thomas." He stiffened. How did it know his name? His mind raced, darting between logic and something darker, something instinctual. His fingers tightened around the receiver. He should hang up. He should hang up now. But his arm refused to obey, his hand frozen in place. The voice continued, and this time it was clearer, though it still sounded wrong, like something trying to pass through a filter that was only half there. "You will follow my instructions. When you do, you will see." The words were heavy with something Thomas couldn't name, something that felt like the beginning of an unraveling. He didn't know why, but his pulse quickened. His chest tightened. He wanted to slam the phone down, wanted to scream into the receiver and make it stop, but his mouth wouldn't move. The voice was pulling at him, like an invisible hand was pressing down on his chest. He felt the weight of it, the weight of the silence. It was suffocating. "Hang up," Thomas finally managed to rasp. The phone line clicked and hummed, but no response came. He heard nothing for a few seconds, the static still dancing in his ears like some far-off song. Then, with a sudden burst of interference, the line went dead. For a long moment, Thomas just stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. His skin felt tight, too tight, like his body was trying to contain something that didn't belong. He set the receiver down slowly, as if afraid of breaking the delicate silence that had settled in his small living room. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, as though they had shifted when his attention wavered. There was something about them that made him uneasy, made his mind spin in circles. He shook his head and forced himself to breathe deeply, as if the air had grown thinner. The phone call was just a prank, just some sick, twisted person on the other end of the line, playing some kind of cruel game. He didn't believe in the supernatural, didn't believe in ghosts or hauntings. He never had. It was just a coincidence. But as he stood up and moved toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water, something shifted in the corner of his eye. A shadow. Just at the edge of the hallway, a quick dart of movement. Thomas froze, his hand halfway to the cabinet. He blinked, the image still there. But then it was gone. Nothing. The sound of the refrigerator humming behind him was deafening in the stillness. He took a deep breath, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. He was overreacting. That was all. The weird phone call, the flickering of shadows. It was nothing. But then the lights flickered. Not just one bulb. No, the entire apartment went dim for a heartbeat, like the electricity had hiccuped, and then returned to normal. Just like that. A glitch in the system. No big deal, Thomas told himself. Just a weird night. He took his glass of water and went back to the couch, his mind still swimming with the sound of that strange, rasping voice. He didn't want to think about it, didn't want to acknowledge how his skin prickled with the weight of something lurking just out of sight. It was probably nothing, but as he sat back down, there it was again, the sound, a scrape from the hallway. Thomas sat still, his blood running cold. He glanced toward the hallway, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The door's closed, he thought. It can't be. But the sound came again, A dragging noise, like someone was shifting around in the hallway outside his apartment, moving in the darkness. He didn't want to get up. He didn't want to look. But the sound persisted, slow, deliberate. A knock. It was faint, but unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of knuckles against wood. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything fell silent again. No more scraping, no more knocking. The hallway was quiet. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. But there was no way to explain it, no way to rationalize what he had just heard. Maybe, just maybe, he had imagined it. He was about to dismiss the whole thing as a fluke when the phone rang again. This time, he didn't hesitate. His fingers shook as he reached for the receiver, as if some unseen force had grabbed hold of him and was pulling him toward it. But when he lifted it, there was no static, no hissing voice, just silence. The line was dead. And in that moment, Thomas knew. He knew that whatever this was, whatever force was reaching into his life, it wasn't finished yet. It had just begun. Thomas couldn't sleep, not that night. The unsettling feeling had clawed its way under his skin, gnawing at him from the inside out. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster, his mind refusing to slow down. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind outside the window seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Every shadow on the walls seemed to be watching him. The phone call, that damn phone call. He couldn't shake it. The voice on the other end, low, distorted, commanding. It had been so wrong, so unsettling, that it still echoed in his mind. But there was something worse, something that dug deeper than just the call itself. The feeling that whatever it was, it had been waiting for him, watching him, and now it had found him. Thomas had tried to rationalize it. He had to. He couldn't let his mind go down that path, the path of superstition and fear. He told himself it was just a prank, a sick joke played by someone who had nothing better to do with their miserable life. Maybe it was an ex-girlfriend or a bored coworker, someone with a warped sense of humor. But the shadows in his apartment weren't listening to his logic. Neither was the phone. It rang again. Thomas's eyes snapped open and his breath hitched. The sound sliced through the room, sharp and immediate. This time it felt different. There was no hesitation, no second thought. His hand reached for the phone, an automatic response, as if something else, something darker, was pulling him toward it. The receiver was cold, icy even, when his fingers wrapped around it. "Hello?" His voice cracked, but he barely recognized it. He felt detached from his own words, like they came from someone else. For a long moment, there was only silence on the other end, a silence so thick it pressed against his eardrums. His fingers twitched around the receiver, waiting for something, anything to break the quiet. Then it came, a low hum, followed by a sharp, rasping breath that felt like it was coming from the bottom of the ocean. The static crackled again, warping the sound, pulling it apart. "You're still here," the voice whispered. The words were fragmented, barely more than a breath in the cold air. "You haven't listened yet." Thomas's pulse quickened, his chest tightened, the room closing in on him. He could almost feel the breath on the other side of the line, like someone was standing just behind him, breathing down his neck. "No," he muttered, almost to himself. "This isn't real. You're not real." But the voice didn't relent. "It's already started," the voice hissed. "You can't stop it now." The static grew louder, a rising storm, as if the very phone line was coming to life. The hum surged, rattling the walls around him. He could almost feel the vibration in his bones, like something crawling under his skin. "Who are you?" His voice broke again, thick with panic. There was a pause, then a sound like a slow exhale. "Who I am doesn't matter," the voice answered, its tone flat, detached. "What matters is that you listen. You listen, or it will come for you." Thomas's hand trembled around the receiver. He wanted to hang up. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, to break the connection that had already begun to invade his life. But his arm felt heavy, like something was holding it there, like something was forcing him to listen. The voice returned, its words more clear now, and they slithered into his mind like poison. "There are things that you can't explain, things that want you, things that feed off your fear." Thomas's breath hitched. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. There had to be some explanation, some way to break free from this madness. But the phone line didn't let him. It was pulling him deeper, twisting his thoughts into knots. Every word the voice spoke planted a seed of doubt, a seed that began to grow, spreading through him, rooting itself into his very core. "I'm waiting," the voice said, just before the line went silent. Thomas stood there, frozen, staring at the receiver in his hand. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling in sharp, quick bursts. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. He hadn't realized the phone had gone silent until it was too late. The line had dropped. The call had ended. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something had shifted. Something had moved in the room. He glanced around, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. The apartment felt wrong. It was the same place, the same room, but everything felt foreign now, unfamiliar. The room, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. He put the receiver down slowly, almost as if it might bite him if he let it fall too quickly. He looked at the phone again, still ringing in his mind, even though the silence had settled in the room. The door to his bedroom creaked open. Thomas's head snapped around. He hadn't opened it. He was sure of it. He always kept it closed, always locked it before bed. But now it was open just a crack, just wide enough to let a sliver of darkness spill into the living room. His heart pounded in his chest. His breath was coming faster, as if he had just run a marathon. He stood up slowly, every part of him screaming to stay still, to remain where he was, but his feet carried him toward the open door. As he approached, his hands shaking violently, the air around him grew colder. It was subtle at first, a mere shift in the temperature, but it intensified as he moved closer. The shadows seemed to stretch, pulling toward him as though the darkness was alive, reaching out to him with unseen hands. He stood in front of the door now, frozen, staring into the room. It was empty. There was nothing there, nothing out of place. Just his bed, his clothes on the chair, the soft light from the hallway spilling across the floor. But then something shifted in the corner of his eye. A small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to make his blood run cold. Something was in there. And then the phone rang again. This time, Thomas didn't even hesitate. His body moved on its own, as if the call had already taken control of him. He grabbed the receiver before he even realized he had done it, and brought it to his ear. His mouth went dry. "Hello?" There was no static this time, no distortion, just silence. But then a soft whisper, a breath, cold and thin, slipped through the line. You should have listened. And then, just as before, the line went dead. Thomas barely slept after that third call. He couldn't bring himself to sleep, not with the weight of it pressing down on him. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in, as though the very air was thickening, suffocating him with every breath. Each time he closed his eyes, he was haunted by the same thing, the phone, the voice, the darkness that had followed him since that first call. It didn't matter how many times he tried to shake it off, or how many distractions he threw at himself. It was always there, just beneath the surface of his thoughts, lurking, waiting. The room had become a cage, its corners pressing inward, tighter with every passing hour. Even the smallest noise, his own breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rattle of the neighbor's pipes, seemed to echo through his skull. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that was already there. That night, after yet another long, fitful day at work, Thomas returned home to the same oppressive silence. The phone sat on the table, its black receiver gleaming under the dull light of the overhead lamp, an ominous presence in the room. His gaze flickered toward it, his stomach twisting. The thought of picking it up made his pulse race, but this time he couldn't run from it, not anymore. He tried to ignore it. He tried to tell himself that this was all just in his head, that he was imagining things. After all, there had to be a reasonable explanation for all this. Maybe someone was playing a cruel prank on him. Maybe he had been sleep-deprived. Maybe he was just going insane. But the longer the silence stretched on, the more he knew that none of those things mattered. The phone wasn't just a piece of plastic and wire. It was a gateway, a door to something else, something far worse than anything he could explain. And as he stared at the phone, a creeping sensation crawled down his spine. It was like an invisible hand was pressing against his back, urging him, pushing him to pick it up. "Pick it up," the voice had whispered. "You're still here." That cold, raspy voice from the night before echoed in his memory, its words replaying in his mind over and over like a broken record. He could still feel the pressure, as if it had left an imprint on his skin, a mark that would never fade. The thought of hearing it again made his stomach churn. But there it was again, that damn phone. It beckoned him like a siren, calling to a sailor in the fog. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to hear it, but he couldn't help it. The phone rang. It was so sudden, so sharp, that it felt like a physical shock, sending a jolt through his entire body. He stared at it, frozen in place, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His heart slammed against his ribs, and then, without thinking, he reached for it. He knew what was coming. He knew he shouldn't do it, knew that the voice on the other end would only drive him deeper into madness. But there was no escaping it now. The darkness was already here, and it was waiting for him. He picked up the receiver, his hand shaking so violently that it rattled in his grip. His breath hitched in his throat as he brought the phone to his ear. For a moment, there was nothing, just static. Hissing, like the air itself, was filled with the sound of something crawling through the wires, dragging itself across the silence. Then the voice came again. "I told you," it whispered, too close, as though it was in the room with him. "You should have listened." His body tensed, every muscle locking up. His mouth was dry, his throat constricted, but he managed to force words past his lips. "What do you want from me?" he gasped, his voice shaking with fear. There was no immediate reply. The static crackled for a moment, like a storm was brewing just on the other side of the line, before the voice returned. It was slower now, deliberate, as if savoring every word. "You already know what I want," it said, "but I will tell you all the same. You will do as I say, or you will be lost." Thomas swallowed, his fingers clutching the receiver so tightly that it almost hurt. His whole body felt like it was vibrating with tension. A part of him wanted to slam the phone down, to disconnect, to try and break free. But he couldn't. Something in him refused to let go. Some primal instinct was keeping him tethered to the call, like a rope pulling him forward, even though he knew it would only lead him to his doom. "You will follow the instructions," the voice said again. "And when you do—" There was a pause, a long, pregnant pause that stretched on like an eternity. "When you do, you will see." His pulse spiked. He had heard that before, when the voice had first spoken to him. It was the same cryptic phrase, the same terrible promise. "You will see." Thomas's skin crawled. What did that mean? What did it want him to see? "Where?" he demanded, his voice rising, desperate. He felt the blood pounding in his ears, his thoughts crashing together like waves on a shore. He had to know. He had to understand. He couldn't keep living in this nightmare. Not like this. There was a long, unsettling silence. Then the voice answered. Its words were slow, almost playful, as though it relished the fear it was provoking. "The door! The door!" For a moment, Thomas didn't understand. He glanced around the room, confusion clouding his mind. He was staring at the phone, but his eyes drifted to the small wooden door at the far end of the room. The closet, the one he always kept shut. No, he thought, not that. But the voice had said it again. The door. Thomas slowly turned his head, a chill settling over him. His gaze was locked on the closet door. The space between him and the door seemed to stretch, becoming a yawning chasm that made his stomach twist. The door, always closed, always locked, was slightly ajar. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't opened it. Not since he'd moved in. But now it was open, and something was waiting for him inside. Thomas stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the slightly ajar door. The closet, the one place in the apartment he never thought about. The one place that, until now, had been entirely mundane, just a closet. Yet now, that simple door, that benign piece of his everyday life, felt like a gaping maw, a hole into something far darker, far more sinister than anything he had ever imagined. He didn't want to move. He didn't want to get any closer to it. But he couldn't look away. It was as if the door had a pull, a magnetic force that kept him rooted in place, like he was being drawn in against his will. The cold, biting air in the room seemed to grow colder, an unnatural chill that clawed at his skin. It made him feel as though the very atmosphere was thickening, as though it had turned into something that wasn't quite air anymore. Something was wrong. Something was wrong with the closet. Something had changed. He didn't even realize it, but his legs had already started moving. He was walking toward it, drawn in like a moth to a flame. No, stop, he told himself, but the words barely made it through the thick fog of terror that had settled in his chest. His feet moved in slow, deliberate steps, like he was walking through water. He could feel the air growing heavier with every inch he gained. When he reached the door, he stopped, his hand hovering over the knob. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides, until he could barely hear the pounding of his own heart. The room felt smaller now, suffocated by the weight of the unknown. He wasn't sure why, but his fingers curled around the door handle, cold and smooth under his grip. His breath was shallow, quick, and he swore he could hear his pulse in his ears, a frantic drumbeat that kept urging him to open the door, to face whatever lay behind it. His body betrayed him. His fingers turned the handle. The door creaked open, slowly, reluctantly. Inside was darkness, thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch beyond what should have been possible. It wasn't like any shadow he had ever seen before. This wasn't the kind of darkness that came with nightfall or a lamp left unlit. No, this was a heavy, consuming blackness that pressed against the walls as though it were alive in a way that the rest of the room was not. Thomas couldn't breathe. The air was thick, heavy, cloying. It felt wrong, like he had stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time, like he had crossed some invisible boundary into territory that no human had any right to occupy. He didn't want to go in. He didn't want to look. But something deep inside him, the same something that had made him pick up the phone each time it rang, the same force that seemed to push him into these terrible, inexplicable situations, was now urging him forward. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, but only slightly. His mind couldn't quite process what it was he was seeing, or rather what he wasn't seeing. It was as if the closet itself didn't want him to see. And then something stirred in the dark, a slow movement, a subtle shift that could have been nothing but the wind. But it wasn't. It couldn't have been. His heart stuttered in his chest, his breath coming in sharp, erratic gasps. His mind screamed for him to close the door, to step away, to leave. But his feet were frozen. His eyes were glued to that darkness. He couldn't move, couldn't look away from whatever it was that was watching him from the shadows. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't through the phone. "Come closer." The words were so faint, so distant, that for a moment he wondered if they were even real. But he felt them, deep inside, pressing against his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. "Come closer." The voice wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a force that made the air around him pulse, like an invisible hand had wrapped itself around his throat and was squeezing tighter with each breath. His fingers clenched the doorframe, the wood splintering beneath his touch. The darkness beckoned to him, the shadows pulling away just enough to show him something else, something moving. At first, it was so subtle, so faint, that Thomas could have easily missed it. A shadow stretching just beyond the corner of his vision. He thought maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, the result of too much fear and not enough sleep. But then the shadow moved again, closer this time, closer still. A shape, a figure, emerging from the blackness. He gasped, stumbling backward, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. The thing in the closet shifted again, but it didn't just shift. It glided. It didn't walk. It didn't stumble. It moved like a shadow, like a ripple in the air. It was behind him before he had even realized it. Number. His mind screamed it, but his body didn't obey. His legs refused to carry him, his arms refusing to move. He turned, slowly, afraid that even the smallest motion would be enough to trigger something worse, and his eyes locked onto what had emerged from the closet. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something that could be easily described. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and thin to the point of being almost skeletal. Its form was draped in a shroud of darkness that made it blend with the shadows around it. But there was something else, something alive, moving within that dark cloak. It had no face, no features, just a blank emptiness where its head should have been. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, as if its bones didn't belong in its body, and every movement was fluid, unsettling, like it didn't have to follow the rules of physics. Its hands, long and spindly, reached out toward him. Thomas felt the pressure of an unseen hand against his chest, pushing him backward, forcing him closer to the figure. His heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the air growing thick around him, pressing in from all sides. The figure didn't speak, but somehow Thomas understood. It was waiting for him to make the next move. The phone. It was the phone. The voice. All of it. It had been leading him here. The voice had been pulling him forward all this time, inch by terrifying inch. You should have listened. The whisper returned, low and distant, but now it was inside him. It was in his veins, his bones. It was part of him. And then the thing reached out. Thomas felt the figure's hand before he saw it. It was cold, too cold, as if it had come from a place where warmth didn't exist, if warmth ever had. The fingers wrapped around his wrist impossibly long, the skin smooth but unyielding, like bone. There was no feeling of skin, no soft pressure or familiar comfort, just a bone-chilling grip, the kind that sank straight through his flesh into his marrow. The force was unbearable, as though it was pulling him toward something far worse than death itself. He gasped, trying to pull away, but the hand didn't let go. It didn't just hold him. It possessed him, dragging him in with an unstoppable strength. The darkness seemed to swirl, expanding outward, devouring the walls, the very air itself. There was nothing but the cold, the relentless pressure, and the figure, the thing that should not have been, that should have remained in the deepest, darkest corners of nightmares. The thing was the nightmare. Its form shifted as though it were made of smoke, twisting and reforming in ways that couldn't be explained. There was no face, no eyes, no mouth, just a void, an emptiness so profound that it made him feel like he was staring into something infinite, a chasm of nothingness that stretched out before him, as if the thing had no end. The longer he stared, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if gravity itself was warping, and every breath he took was a labor. "Come closer," it whispered again, its voice not a sound, but a pressure, a command that pushed into his thoughts, digging under his skin. "You have to come closer." He couldn't. His body refused to obey. His heart was pounding against his ribs, fighting, thrashing, screaming for release. But still, the hand tightened around his wrist, and then the other one reached out, slowly, inexorably, its fingers brushing against his skin like tendrils of ice. He flinched, the cold cutting through his bones, and his mind screamed in horror. It was like the thing didn't have to speak to make him feel it. It didn't have to tell him what it wanted. It knew. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn away, to run, to break free of this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows pressed in from all sides, closing the space between him and the thing, leaving him with nothing but the dim glow of his own fear. It was suffocating, drowning him in its silence and its cold, cold presence. He had to do something, anything, but no matter how hard he tried to move, his body wouldn't respond. His feet were frozen to the floor, his hands held captive by the unnatural grip of the creature that stood before him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it any more, the voice came again. But this time it was not distant. It was not echoing through the static of the phone. It was right next to his ear. "You will do as I say." The words were a command wrapped in a promise of despair. And it was then, as the thing's cold breath brushed against his skin, that Thomas realized the truth, what he had been avoiding all along, the truth he couldn't see, couldn't understand until now. He had been listening to the voice for too long. He had been following its commands, its whispers, its demands. But it wasn't the voice that had been controlling him all along. It had never been the voice. It had been the thing in the closet, the thing in the shadows. It was the one that had guided him, driven him, forced him down this path. And now it was here, standing before him, pulling him closer, demanding his surrender. The thing didn't need to speak anymore. It didn't have to tell him what was next. It didn't have to say anything. It already had him. "You will come," it whispered again, a final demand that didn't need to be made. "And when you do, you will see what I have planned for you." The hand tightened, a vice on his wrist. He could feel his pulse, slow at first, then faster, then erratic. His thoughts, all clarity and reason, began to warp and twist, breaking apart like glass. Everything around him began to spin, the room shrinking until it was just the figure and him, and nothing else. Thomas had never felt so small. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. No sound, no voice. The thing dragged him forward, and as he moved, he felt something break inside him, something that had always been whole before. It wasn't pain exactly, but a deep, gnawing emptiness, as if the very essence of him was being pulled away. And with each step he took, he felt that part of himself slip further and further away. When he reached the closet, the world around him began to dissolve, the edges of everything blurring into darkness. He didn't know if he was still standing or if he was floating. It didn't matter anymore. He had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. He didn't want to look inside. He didn't want to see what waited for him. But the grip on his wrist tightened, and he could feel the force of the thing's presence pressing him forward. Slowly, he stepped into the closet, and there, standing in the center of the darkness, was a mirror. It was small, framed in dark wood that looked ancient, warped, as though it had been there for far longer than it had any right to be. Thomas stepped closer, drawn to it despite himself, the darkness swirling around him like a storm. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror, and when he looked into it, he saw himself, or rather, he saw what he had become. His reflection wasn't his own. The man staring back at him wasn't Thomas. No, this was something darker, something that had been twisted beyond recognition. His eyes were black, voids of nothingness, empty and hollow. His face was pale, gaunt, stretched beyond its normal features, like something had been eating away at him from the inside. But worse than the reflection was the thing behind him. It was there. The thing had been inside him all along. And as Thomas stared at his own reflection, he realized the horrifying truth. The voice had never been outside of him. It had always been part of him, feeding off his fear, guiding him, pushing him toward the dark. And now that he had looked, now that he had seen it for what it truly was, he couldn't turn away. He was lost. Forever. The mirror reflected him back into the darkness, and that was the last thing Thomas ever saw, the last breath he ever took. The house was too quiet. Samuel Miller had always appreciated silence. He'd grown up in a rural town where the chirp of crickets and the soft rustle of wind in the trees were the only sounds that seemed to matter. But here, in this house, this new place, there was something off about the stillness. It was more than just the silence. It was the feeling that the walls were watching him, listening, waiting. Samuel wasn't superstitious. He'd always been a man of reason, a man who believed in the concrete, in things that could be touched and measured. He'd bought the house on a whim, looking for a fresh start, a new beginning. The idea of moving into an old Victorian house had been too alluring to resist. He liked the charm, the mystery, the sense of history that hung in the air, even if it was a little rough around the edges. The real estate agent had warned him that it needed work. Plumbing, electrical, the usual, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. It had all seemed so perfect. And yet, there was that silence. And then, there were the noises. It started a few days after he moved in. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint scratch, like a mouse digging at the drywall, a soft tapping sound from behind the walls. He thought little of it. Old houses made noises, he'd told himself. It was nothing. Perhaps a rodent. Maybe some settling. He'd put a few traps down in the basement and moved on. But the sounds grew louder. The scratching became more pronounced, followed by a thudding noise that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. It wasn't like the occasional creak of old wood or the groan of a house settling into its foundations. No, these noises had a rhythm, a sense of intent. They were deliberate. Samuel would sit in his living room trying to relax after a long day of unpacking, and the sounds would come. Thud, scratch, thud, scratch. It was almost as though something was pacing in the walls, trapped and restless. He'd jump up every time, heart racing, hands clamming. He'd press his ear to the wall, straining to hear. But the moment he did, the sound would stop. At first, he considered calling an exterminator, but the house seemed so solid, the walls so thick. Besides, what kind of animal made rhythmic sounds like that? It was more like someone, or something, was trying to get out. He had never been the type to fear his own home, but this was different. He started to notice other things too, small things. A cupboard door left slightly open when he was sure he'd shut it. A light flickering even when the bulbs were new. The temperature fluctuated erratically, as though someone was playing with the thermostat. At night, he would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to come again. And sure enough, it always did. The thudding, the scratching. But one night, it was different. It was past midnight, and Samuel was sitting in his living room again, trying to watch TV, trying to ignore the dread that seemed to grow with each passing moment. The house was bathed in darkness, save for the dim glow of the television. He heard the scratching first, light at first, and then the unmistakable thud, louder, more urgent. He could feel it now. It wasn't just the noise that unsettled him. It was the awareness that something was happening, something he wasn't meant to understand. Samuel stood up. He moved toward the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The thudding from behind the walls grew louder, like a hammer against the plaster. With each step, it felt like the house itself was reverberating, vibrating with a kind of unsettling energy. He approached the wall in the hallway, the place where the noise seemed to be the loudest. He pressed his hand against it. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been for a room that had been heated all day. Thud, thud. His breath quickened. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but he could no longer ignore the compulsion pulling him forward. This house, this strange, old house, had secrets. He was sure of it now. He glanced down at the hallway floor. His feet felt heavy, like they were trudging through deep mud. His head spun with dizziness, a dull ache beginning to spread across his temples. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, and it had been waiting for him. He grabbed a hammer from the workbench in the kitchen and, with a strange sense of resolve, returned to the hallway. The noise continued to reverberate through the walls, growing more insistent with every passing second. With a deep breath, Samuel lifted the hammer and swung it down against the drywall. It splintered easily, much easier than he had anticipated. The crackling of the drywall as it gave way to the force of the hammer was almost satisfying. He swung again and again until a jagged hole had appeared in the wall, large enough for him to stick his hand through. The noise behind the wall stopped. A tense silence followed, and Samuel stood frozen, his hand still pressed against the hole, his heart hammering in his chest. For a long, lingering moment, he considered stopping. Maybe the noise had been nothing. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe he was just tired. But something kept pushing him forward, something far more compelling than reason. He reached his hand into the hole, pulling back large chunks of drywall, his fingers shaking as he dug deeper. The hole widened, and the scraping sound resumed, this time louder and more frantic than before. His heart pounded in his chest as his fingers met something cold, something smooth beneath the layers of debris. He hesitated for a moment. Something inside him told him to stop, to put the hammer down and walk away. But it was too late now. He pulled at the object. It came free with a soft scrape, and his fingers brushed against it, a small, flat surface. He pulled it into the dim light, his breath catching in his throat. It was a wooden board, old and stained. The edges were ragged, as though they had been torn away from something long forgotten. There were symbols carved into the surface, strange, twisting shapes that made his eyes ache to look at them. And, in the center of the board, something that looked like dried blood. He recoiled, a sharp shiver running down his spine. The blood looked fresh, too fresh. The house was silent again, deadly silent. The air felt heavier now, like something was pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the scratching resumed, louder this time and with more purpose, more like a scream than a scratch. Samuel jumped back, the blood-stained board falling from his hand and clattering to the floor. He was not alone. Samuel stood motionless in the hallway, his breath shallow and ragged, the sudden rush of cold sweat soaking his back. The wooden board, its surface covered with what could only be described as dried blood, lay in front of him, its dark crimson staining the cream-colored carpet. He felt like he had stumbled into something ancient, something that didn't belong in a house like this, something that had been waiting for years, maybe longer, and now it was awake. The scratching, no, the scraping sound started again. It was more desperate now, scraping against the drywall like claws against bone. It reverberated, an eerie harmony of agitation, rattling in his chest, crawling under his skin. Samuel took a hesitant step back, his mind a swirl of confusion. He reached out for the wall to steady himself, his palm slapping against the cold surface. The old plaster felt like ice beneath his hand, but the moment his fingers made contact with the wall, a shiver rippled through his spine, deep and heavy, like a warning. Something was here. Something was moving in the walls, not inside them, behind them, beneath them, pressing outward from the space where the house's old bones had grown weak. And it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was alive. For a long moment, Samuel stared at the hole in the wall, the jagged edges staring back at him like the mouth of some terrible creature. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribcage, the weight of fear pressing on his chest. Sweat beaded along his brow, and he wiped it away, his fingers trembling. The bloodstains on the wooden board were still fresh, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the hallway. It was as if it had just been placed there, waiting for him to discover it, waiting for him to find out what had been hidden. He bent down, reaching for the board again, his hand shaking so violently now that he could barely grasp it. The symbols carved into it seemed to ripple and shift in his vision, playing tricks on his eyes as if they were alive too, alive in the way they twisted and contorted, forcing his mind to keep questioning what they meant, what they were. But before he could touch it, the house groaned, the very air thick with an invisible pressure. Samuel froze, his fingers inches from the stained wood, and for the briefest second he thought he saw something move. No, not saw, felt, out of the corner of his eye. Something dark. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The whispering started then. At first it was soft, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of the house itself. Low, guttural muttering that clawed its way into his ears, making his skin tighten with dread. The whispers sounded like words, words that were hard to make out, twisted and garbled, slipping in and out of his comprehension like something ancient trying to speak from the other side of time. But then, clearer, louder. "Get out!" The voice was unmistakable, low and guttural, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The words seemed to vibrate in his chest, clawing at his insides. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. He looked around, his pulse hammering in his ears, searching the empty hallway as if expecting something or someone to step out of the shadows. But the house remained still, too still. "Leave now!" It was louder this time, more insistent. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the voice, shaking beneath his feet, as if the house itself was coming alive with the sound. The whispers twisted and warped, overlapping each other, becoming a cacophony of unintelligible noise. The air in the hallway felt thick, like it was pressing down on him, making it harder and harder to breathe. Samuel's mind screamed at him to run, to get out. He had to get out, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. His body didn't respond, and as the whispers turned into an almost manic chanting, his throat tightened with fear. "Stop looking," the voice said, as though it were speaking directly into his mind. "Stop digging. It knows you're here." The walls around him began to throb, the wood of the house creaking and groaning, as if protesting the very presence of Samuel in its domain. It wasn't just the house anymore. Whatever was in the walls, whatever was behind them, it was alive, and it was awake. Samuel tried to pull away, tried to step back, but the darkness in the house seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on him from all sides, swallowing the light of the dim hallway. The scratches in the walls turned into violent thuds again, echoing like a hammer on stone, and he could feel the vibrations deep in his bones, a painful, relentless thrum that made his teeth ache. His hand found the wooden board again, and in that moment, something in his mind snapped. He couldn't not know any more. He couldn't unsee the bloodstains, the symbols, the terrible whispers in his ears. Something was waiting for him. Something had been waiting for him to uncover it, to crack open the walls of this place and peel back the layers of the house's dark, bloody history. Samuel grabbed the board, his hands clenched tight around it, and, with a primal scream, he yanked it up. The floor beneath him shuddered, and then, in the silence that followed, he heard it, a sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was like a breath, deep and labored, like something was inhaling from the walls, drawing in the air around him. A breath so cold it made his skin break out in goosebumps. The whispering grew louder. You shouldn't have, shouldn't have, shouldn't have. A voice, desperate and pleading, filled with a deep, guttural dread. It wasn't the house speaking anymore. No, this wasn't the house. This was something older, something deeper, something that had been inside the house long before Samuel ever set foot in it. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as his eyes flicked back toward the hole in the wall. The light from the hallway flickered, casting long, twisting shadows that danced unnaturally, as though the house itself was alive in the way it was watching him. And then something caught his eye. A symbol, one of the strange, warped shapes etched into the wooden board, was now etched into the wall, scrawled in the same dark, sinister substance. It was unmistakable. The blood, the same blood he had seen on the board, now flowing from the wall as though it were alive, as though the wall itself was bleeding. And that's when Samuel realized the truth. The house had been waiting for him, and it wasn't his to uncover, not anymore. It had chosen him. The blood was still flowing from the wall. It wasn't a trick of the light, no shadow playing on the plaster in just the right way to deceive his eyes. Samuel could see it clearly now. Dark streaks were creeping down the wall, like veins feeding from some unseen source, deep within the house itself. The blood was thick, like oil, and it pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, as though it were alive. It wasn't the kind of blood that would come from any human being. This was something ancient, something other. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The floor beneath him felt unstable, as though it might give way at any moment, and his legs wobbled like a newborn colt learning how to walk. He reached out instinctively, but then hesitated. There was something about that blood. It called to him in a way he couldn't explain, as though it had been there for him, waiting, waiting. The blood streaked across the plaster like a message, but the meaning was lost on him. The symbols, the same twisting, incomprehensible shapes he'd seen on the board, were now scrawled across the wall, etched in the dark fluid. The smell of it was overwhelming, sickly sweet with the faint tang of iron, like something that had long since passed from living flesh into the realm of the dead. It was like standing at the edge of a chasm, looking down at something so deep, so unknowable, that even the thought of it made his stomach churn. His fingers were trembling, but he couldn't stop them. He had to know more. He reached out. His fingers brushed against the blood-stained wall. The moment his skin made contact with it, a jolt of cold surged up his arm, as though the wall itself had come alive. A surge of energy, not like electricity, but something far darker, pulsed through him. filling him with a sense of vertigo. It was as if the house had reached out and wrapped its fingers around his soul. The whispering began again. This time, it wasn't the same faint murmuring. No, this was different. It was louder, closer, more distinct. The voice had a weight to it now, a presence that pressed against him like a physical force, its breath warm and foul, as though it were standing directly behind him. "You shouldn't have." The voice hissed in his ear, and he spun around, his heart in his throat. But there was nothing there. No shadow, no figure, no sign of anything that could have made that sound. It was like the walls themselves had spoken. The blood on the wall pulsed again, more violently now. "Don't look." The words were sharp, urgent, filled with an almost palpable sense of danger. But Samuel couldn't tear his gaze away. His mind told him to run, to leave, to forget everything. But his body, his hand, refused to listen. The house held him captive in its silence. The scratching behind the wall started again, louder than before. It wasn't just scraping now, it was scratching and scraping, like nails dragging across glass. Whatever was inside those walls, whatever had been hidden there, buried for God knows how long, was angry. The blood started to bubble, slowly at first, then faster, as though something deep within the house was pushing it to the surface. Samuel stepped back, his pulse racing, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Something was stirring behind the walls, something that had been waiting for him to break through, waiting for the house to give up its secrets. The walls throbbed again, and Samuel was thrown back, crashing against the floor. The house shook as if caught in a convulsion. The air grew heavy, thick with something ancient, as if the very foundations of the house were coming undone. The blood continued to pulse and writhe, slick and unnatural, like some horrible wound in the heart of the house itself. Samuel gasped for air, his lungs struggling to breathe as if the house were choking him. The whispering grew louder, and for the first time, he could understand it clearly. "You should never have come. It will have you." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a guttural growl, deep and resonant. It was in his head now, clawing at his mind, sinking into his thoughts like poison. Samuel's vision blurred, his body trembling as though he were standing at the brink of madness. The house wasn't just alive. It was aware of him. It was conscious of his every move, of his every breath. It was toying with him. And then it hit him. The house wasn't haunted in the way he thought. It wasn't just spirits or restless ghosts or a place cursed by some ancient tragedy. No, this house was alive, and it had been waiting for him to tear at the walls, to uncover what had been hidden deep inside. Samuel's throat tightened, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His hand reached down again, almost of its own accord, to touch the blood-stained symbols on the wall. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the feeling that it was already too late to turn back. Maybe it was the need to know, to finally understand. His fingers touched the symbol, and the house screamed. It wasn't a sound Samuel could hear with his ears, but one he could feel deep in his bones. It vibrated through his chest, through his skull, and rattled the very core of his being. The entire house shook. The walls cracked, and the air turned rancid with the taste of rot and decay. A dark figure rose from the wall, crawling like something that had been birthed from the depths of the earth. It was a shadow. No, not a shadow. Something darker than darkness itself, formless, and yet somehow alive. Samuel's heart stopped. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure grew larger, reaching toward him with arms that seemed to stretch and twist like ropes of darkness. Its presence was suffocating, its very existence oppressive. The whispering came again, but this time it was no longer a voice. It was a presence, a cold, hungry force that filled his mind with fear, with despair. You sought the truth. The voice was now in his mind, no longer spoken, but felt. Now you will pay the price. The figure reached out, and with a single unnatural motion, it touched him. And then everything went black. The world, for a brief moment, was a blur, a swirl of shadows and light that seemed to slip through his fingers like water. Samuel's body, paralyzed by a cold grip that had nothing to do with the chill in the air, felt weightless. The oppressive presence of the figure, the thing that had crawled out of the wall, seemed to have devoured every trace of life from the house, leaving behind only its dark, suffocating power. He couldn't breathe. The thing had touched him. He could feel it still, like something was embedded in his skin, deep inside him, twisting, gnawing, burrowing through his veins. It wasn't pain. It was worse than pain. It was a hunger that wanted to consume him whole, devour his very soul. The world around him faded in and out of focus, the house shifting and warping, its walls swelling and contracting like a living, breathing creature. A faint sound, distant and far off, reached his ears, though it was so muffled and unclear it could have been the remnants of his own breath, or maybe his mind, unraveling. The house was alive. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't some creepy story about a haunted mansion. The house was alive, and whatever had been locked away inside it, whatever had been festering behind those walls, had waited for him. It had been waiting for someone to come along, someone foolish enough to disturb it, to uncover it. He wasn't sure how long he had been lying there, trapped in that strange, disorienting state. His mind raced, flashes of memory coming and going, the walls, the blood, the symbols, the whispering, that cold hand reaching out from the darkness. And then there was the message. Now you will pay the price. It echoed in his skull, a relentless drumbeat that refused to stop, digging deeper into his mind, sinking into the marrow of his bones. Samuel's heart pounded wildly in his chest, but his body still refused to move. The thing that had touched him, whatever dark entity had crawled from the walls, had left its mark on him. And that mark was more than physical. It was in him. The bloodstains, the symbols, the whispers. It wasn't just the house anymore. The house had marked him, claimed him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his eyes fluttered open. The hallway was dim, the shadows creeping up the walls like tendrils of ink. His body felt heavy, every muscle aching as if it had been pulled taut, as though the walls themselves had tried to crush him. His head throbbed, and his vision blurred. His mouth was dry, his breath ragged, but something was different. He knew. Deep down, he knew that the house had changed him. Samuel struggled to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him. He was covered in a sheen of cold sweat, and the once familiar scent of the house now seemed wrong. It was no longer the smell of wood and dust and old things. No, it smelled of rot, of decay, of something that had been left to fester for too long. And then the whispers started again, not from the walls. Number. They were in his head now, inside his skull, pressing against his temples, twisting through his thoughts. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to it now. The voice, no, it wasn't a voice. It was more like a presence, a pressure in his mind, was everywhere. It felt like it was pulling him, tugging him forward, guiding him down the dark hallway. But there was something else, something more insidious. The walls were watching him. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet felt like a quiet, deliberate step taken by something unseen. The shadows at the end of the hallway seemed to reach for him, stretching, elongating in impossible ways. Samuel's hand shot out, gripping the doorframe to steady himself, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was beginning to see things. Out of the corner of his eyes, the shadows moved, swirling, as if the very fabric of the house was warping around him. The house was alive, and it wanted him. It had always wanted him. He took a step back, but his feet felt like they were stuck in place, as if the floor itself was refusing to let him leave. It was all he could do to keep standing. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to push down on him, suffocating him with every passing second. The walls closed in, inch by inch, until they were pressing against his skin, against his lungs, against his thoughts. The whispering grew louder. "You've seen it. You've touched it. Now you can never leave." And then something shifted. The air in the hallway grew thick, heavy with the scent of blood, the taste of something metallic in the back of his throat. The symbols, those twisted, grotesque carvings, started to glow. Not brightly, not with light, but with darkness. They bled into the walls, spreading like ink, like a stain that was slowly overtaking everything in its path. Samuel's stomach churned. His vision was spinning, the darkness swallowing him whole, but his legs carried him forward, unwilling, like a marionette, at the mercy of some invisible force. He was still moving, still walking, though he didn't want to. He had to get out. He had to get out. But the house had other plans. And then, through the haze of confusion and terror, he saw it. At the end of the hallway, no, it wasn't a hallway anymore. It was a chamber, a massive, cavernous space that stretched endlessly into the darkness. There was something in the middle of it, something tall, hunched, and wrong. A shadowed figure that seemed to flicker and fade with every blink of his eyes. It was the same figure from before, the one he had seen in the wall, the one who had come from the blood. It was waiting for him. And then, just as he was about to move toward it, the whispering stopped. The walls were silent, but that silence was worse than anything he had ever heard. It was as though the house had stopped breathing. The air had gone still, and with it, Samuel could feel the ground beneath him trembling ever so slightly, as if the house itself had shifted. And then the whisper came again, clearer now, more forceful, as though it were coming from inside his own body. "You're too late." In an instant, Samuel's heart seemed to stop. The house, the blood, the symbols, everything, all at once collapsed in on him. The silence in the house was suffocating. The walls had closed in on Samuel. He felt trapped, like an insect caught in a web, its threads sticky and binding, pulling him in every direction. His legs no longer obeyed him, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The house, the walls, the blood, the symbols had become one, a single, monstrous entity, and Samuel was at its mercy. The figure in the chamber, the shadow he'd seen before, was now standing at the center of the room. It was no longer just a vague outline, a flickering shape. Number It had taken form. He could see its features now, though not in any way that made sense. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and cloaked in a flowing black robe that seemed to consume the light around it. The air around it rippled, as though the very fabric of reality bent and warped in its presence. Its face was a blur, a shifting mass of darkness and cold. It didn't have eyes, not in the way humans did, but there was an undeniable sense that it saw him, that it knew him. Samuel's blood ran cold. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream, but his legs were frozen, his feet cemented to the floor by some unseen force. It was as if the very house itself had him in its grip, holding him hostage, keeping him in place to witness whatever horror was about to unfold. The figure didn't move at first. It simply stood there, watching him, waiting for him to understand. The whispering began again, this time louder, more frantic, more insistent. It was no longer a faint murmur in the distance. It was inside his head, in his thoughts, in his bones. You should have left. You should have run. Samuel's hands twitched, his breath catching in his throat. The urge to move, to escape, was unbearable. But it wasn't just fear that held him. There was something else, something deeper, something dark inside him that didn't want to run, something that wanted to stay, something that was calling to him, pulling him toward the shadowed figure. The blood in the walls, the blood that had once been a quiet stream of crimson, had stopped moving. It had coagulated, darkened into a sticky, tar-like substance. The symbols on the walls, too, had ceased their unnatural glow. The house was still. Samuel felt his heart thud in his chest, the thrum of it matching the pulse of the walls, matching the pulse of the house itself. It was the heartbeat of something ancient, something that had been here long before he ever stepped foot in this place, something that had waited. You've seen the truth now, haven't you? The voice came from the figure, not from its mouth, but from everywhere, from within the very walls of the house. It wrapped itself around Samuel's mind, pressing in on him, suffocating him. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet its presence was undeniable. It was as if the figure was the house, it was the walls, it was the blood. Samuel wanted to scream, but the scream was stuck in his throat, lodged behind the fear that had turned his insides to stone. He could feel the weight of it now, the knowledge of it, the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. The house had become something that fed on the living, something that grew stronger with each soul it consumed. And Samuel had been brought here for one reason, to feed it, to join it. He realized then that the house had chosen him, just as it had chosen every other poor soul who had come before him. It wasn't just the blood on the walls that had called to him. It was the house itself, and the house had fed on those who were foolish enough to uncover its secrets. Samuel had thought he could outsmart it. He had thought he could fight it. But now he understood. The house was never meant to be defeated. It was alive, and it would always find a way to survive. And it had been waiting for him. It had been waiting for him to come, to tear at the walls, to uncover the truth, to break the seal. He had been lured in from the very first step he took across the threshold. You wanted to know. Now you do. The figure in front of him raised one hand, and for a moment, everything went still. There was no sound, no movement, just the suffocating silence that pressed against his ears, louder than anything he had ever known. He could feel the darkness gathering around him, like the walls were closing in, suffocating him in a way no human mind could possibly comprehend. And then the walls themselves seemed to breathe. The blood, thick and dark, began to move again. It slithered across the floor, pooling and spreading like liquid death. The symbols on the walls twisted and writhed, no longer static, but alive, squirming and shifting with impossible speed. The house had awakened. Samuel felt something cold crawl down his spine, and in that moment, the fear he had been trying to suppress, fears of death, of darkness, of losing control, overcame him. He wanted to run. He needed to run, but it was too late. He could feel the walls around him growing tighter, closing in on him, the blood spreading faster than he could move, the whispers too loud to block out. "You are one of us now," the voice said again, this time with a terrible finality. And then Samuel understood. The house didn't just kill. The house absorbed, it consumed, and once it had taken its fill, it left nothing behind, nothing but an empty shell, a hollow corpse, and a part of the house itself. Samuel's body trembled as the blood reached his feet, and the coldness spread through his veins like ice. His vision blurred, and his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. There was nothing left to do now but wait. Wait for the house to take him, to claim him, just as it had claimed all the others. And as the blood wrapped around him like 1,000 invisible hands, pulling him down, Samuel realized the truth. There was no escape from this place. The house would have him. The walls closed in completely, and Samuel's final scream was swallowed by the darkness. There's a moment in every man's life, a single breath, when he hopes, really hopes, he can outrun the ghosts of his past. David Marshall thought he could do that. He thought he could pack up his things, leave the crumbling remains of a life behind, and step into a new place, a new story. He had no illusions about starting fresh. There was no such thing. But the house could at least give him a moment of peace, he told himself. David had always been a practical man. He had never been one to believe in spirits, ghosts, or other nonsense. The world was a place of cold logic and reason, and he had learned to navigate it with a stiff upper lip, even as the weight of loss pressed down on him. His wife, gone. His son, gone. The memories of their voices had grown faint, but they still lingered, like the slow, bitter taste of coffee, long after the last sip. The house was small, a quaint two-story affair on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear into the background, a place where no one would ask too many questions, where the world couldn't reach him. The old realtor had spoken of it fondly, calling it a diamond in the rough. She said it just needed a little TLC, a touch of paint, and maybe a few new windows. To David, that sounded perfect. He stood in the front yard now, staring at the old house, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the crumbling bricks and faded trim. The air felt thick, like something heavy was sitting just out of reach. The trees surrounding the house were tall and old, casting long shadows across the front porch. There was something about the place that felt off, though David couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the windows stared blankly back at him, the glass reflecting the fading light like dead eyes. Or maybe it was the smell. It wasn't a strong smell, not at first, but it was there. A faint odor that crept through the cracks in the door and lingered in the corners of the room. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, but it was wrong. A sickly, musty scent, like something had been rotting for years in the walls. At first, David thought it was just the house's age, the dust and decay that clung to old things, but the longer he stayed, the more it gnawed at him. The first night, he tried to ignore it. He unpacked his bag, hung up his few belongings, and ate a small dinner in the kitchen, which was dim and sparse. As he ate, he thought about the things he was leaving behind. The house where his wife had died, the place that still smelled like her perfume, the house where their son had grown up and eventually left for college. It was all gone now, burned to the ground in the fire that had taken everything from him. The only thing left of them was the heavy weight of memories. He was free of that weight now, or so he thought. A fresh start was what he needed. By the time he finished his meal, the sun had long since set, and the darkness outside had crept into the house like a living thing. The smell, too, had crept deeper into his senses. It was subtle but undeniable, a sharp, rotting tang that made his throat tighten and his stomach twist. He turned on the lights in the living room, trying to push the sensation away, but it lingered, hovering at the edges of his consciousness. He tried to push the thought from his mind. Old houses smelled strange. They always did. The wind outside had picked up, moaning through the trees, causing the branches to scrape against the house like the sound of fingernails on glass. It wasn't unusual for the air to carry a certain chill in the night, either. David had grown accustomed to the quiet loneliness of the world, the way it crept up on him when the night grew late and the house stood still, as if holding its breath. But the smell, it gnawed at him. He went upstairs to bed. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, as they always do in old homes. It was nothing, just the house settling. It wasn't until he lay down in the small bedroom, tucked beneath the thin blankets, that he heard it again, the faint scratch of something moving, something unseen in the walls. The sound was almost imperceptible, like tiny claws scraping against the plaster. David sat up in bed, his heart thudding in his chest, though he had no idea why. The house had its noises, sure. Every old house did. The plumbing, the pipes, the wind, it was nothing but that smell and the scratching. It came again, louder this time. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was rhythmic, unrelenting. David climbed out of bed and walked over to the door, his bare feet cold against the floorboards. He opened the door slowly, half expecting something to leap out at him. The hallway stretched dark and quiet before him. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath. The smell was stronger now, sharper, clinging to the air like something rotting under the floorboards. David swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The hallway seemed longer than it had been before, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, creeping closer. He turned toward the stairs that led up to the attic. That's where the smell seemed to be coming from, the place where the air felt thickest, where the scratching sound was the loudest. David hesitated. He could ignore it. He could close the door, go back to bed, pretend it wasn't happening. After all, it was just an old house. Things settled. Things creaked. It was probably just a rat in the walls or some other innocent explanation. But David had always been the type to face his fears head on, to face the unknown rather than hide from it. His hands shook, but he gripped the railing tightly as he climbed the stairs to the attic. The door was cracked open, and through the sliver of light, he could see dust swirling in the air. The smell hit him like a wall, a sharp stench of decay that made his stomach turn. But there was something else in the air now, something more sinister. He couldn't put his finger on it. Not yet. He pushed the door open. It creaked loudly in protest. And as it swung fully open, the air in the attic felt like a weight pressing down on him. His heart began to race. And there it was, a journal. It was lying on the floor, half hidden behind an old trunk, as if someone had left it there on purpose. The pages were yellowed with age, the cover cracked and worn, as if it had been opened 1,000 times. David's fingers trembled as he picked it up. As he opened the first page, the faint smell of old ink and something else, something metallic, filled his nostrils. He squinted at the words, trying to make sense of them. The journal was old, very old, but it was the message inside that made his skin crawl. David stared at the journal in his hands, his fingers trembling. The smell of decay seemed to intensify around him, a sour, fetid stench that clung to the air like a curse. His heart pounded in his chest, an incessant thud that matched the rapid rise and fall of his breath. The house felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the attic itself had grown darker in his presence. The pages of the journal were old, yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, yet legible. David had been expecting something mundane, perhaps notes on the house's previous owners, a simple log of repairs and updates, but the words he saw on the first page made his stomach lurch. To those who come after, beware. This house is not as it seems. It is not merely brick and wood. It is a living thing, and it feeds. David's eyes scanned the words, but his mind couldn't quite process them. He glanced around the attic again, as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the dusty old trunk. He took a shaky breath, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. It was just an old journal, nothing more. Whoever had written these words had clearly been an eccentric, maybe even paranoid. It wasn't uncommon for people to leave behind strange writings or odd thoughts in the places they inhabited. But as David flipped to the next page, his unease grew. The next entry was just as cryptic and far more disturbing. The smell of death is the first sign. It begins with a faint odor, a scent of decay that clings to the walls. Then comes the scratching, the noise that starts softly, but soon becomes unbearable. It is the house waking up. The house is hungry, and once it starts feeding, there is no escape. David's breath caught in his throat. The words were too close, too real. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He glanced over his shoulder again, half expecting to see someone standing behind him. The attic, though, was empty, save for the dust and the piles of forgotten junk. It has fed before. It has taken others. If you do not perform the ritual, you will be next. The ritual is simple. You must offer a piece of your soul, your deepest fear, and the house will be satisfied. The smell will fade, and the hunger will cease for a time. David dropped the journal onto the floor, his heart racing. His hands were slick with sweat, and the blood had drained from his face. He stared at the journal like it was a venomous snake, something that could bite him if he got too close. But he couldn't stop himself from picking it up again, his eyes scanning the next page with an urgency he didn't fully understand. The next words were written in a hasty, frenzied script, as if the person who had written them had been racing against time. The house cannot be destroyed. It will never be destroyed. It was built on a foundation of darkness, on the bones of something that has existed long before us. Those who come to live here, those who dare to stay, will be consumed by it. The smell of death will only grow stronger. You must leave. Leave before the seventh night. Leave before it claims you. David closed the journal with a snap. His hands shook violently. the book now an unreadable mass of trembling fingers and raw nerves. The air around him had grown thick, heavy, with a sense of dread. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, watching him. It was too much. The scratching noise had stopped, but the smell was still there, clinging to his clothes, his skin. He could taste it, that sharp, rancid stench at the back of his throat. David's pulse raced. He couldn't understand it. This was just a house, just an old, dilapidated house with old, crumbling walls. That was all. This thing in the journal, it was nothing. Just the ramblings of a madman, right? The fear, the terror, it was all in his mind. But then why did the smell seem to be growing stronger? Why did the air feel so suffocating? He wanted to leave, to run far away from this place. But the thought of abandoning the house felt like failure, like admitting defeat. The house had promised him peace, hadn't it? It had promised him a new beginning, a chance to move past the tragedy of his past, to start fresh. And now it was turning on him, feeding on his fear, pulling him into something he didn't understand. David stepped backward, away from the journal, his feet catching on the floorboards. His head was spinning, his thoughts a mess of confusion and panic. The attic, the house, the journal, it was all wrong. There had to be an explanation, didn't there? There had to be something logical to all of this. The scratching sound came again. David froze. This time it was louder. It was closer. His heart skipped a beat. The noise was coming from the walls in the attic, where the smell had started, where the journal had been. The scratching was frantic now, almost like something was trapped inside the walls, desperately trying to escape. "It's just the house settling," David muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "It's just the pipes. Old houses make noises." But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. There was something else, something far darker. Without thinking, he walked toward the wall where the noise seemed to be coming from. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around and run out of the attic. But he couldn't. He had to know. He had to understand what was happening. His hands trembled as he reached out, feeling along the cold, damp wood of the wall. The scratching sound grew louder, the noise echoing through the attic like a warning. Then, as his hand brushed against the surface of the wall, he felt it. A small, sharp ridge, hidden beneath the layers of dust and grime. David's breath caught in his throat. He pressed harder, digging his fingers into the wood, and the ridge gave way, revealing a small, hidden compartment behind the wall. His heart thudded in his chest as he peeled back the old wood, revealing what lay behind it. Inside the compartment, there was something that made David's blood run cold. A small, shriveled hand. It was a human hand, or what was left of it. The fingers were skeletal, the skin mottled and decayed. The nails were cracked and blackened, and there was something dark, crawling beneath the skin, like it was alive. David stumbled back, gasping for air. He was shaking now, the world spinning around him. The hand, the rotting hand, was the final confirmation of what he had suspected. The house was more than just a building. It was alive, and it had been feeding for years. The smell was no longer just a smell. It was a warning, and it was getting closer. David stumbled back from the compartment, his legs shaking beneath him. The hand lay in front of him, a twisted, shriveled thing that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. His stomach lurched, and for a moment he thought he might actually vomit. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no logic here, no reason. The hand, the stench, it was all part of something much darker than he could have ever imagined. He felt the walls closing in around him, the air thick and heavy, suffocating. His breath was ragged, shallow. The house was no longer a quiet retreat from his troubled past. It had become a prison, a place where the shadows seemed to move and breathe. It was as if the house itself was waiting for him, watching, anticipating his every move. And as the smell, the overwhelming foul odor grew stronger, David felt a terrible realization sink into his bones. The house was alive. The thought was absurd, of course. Houses didn't live, they didn't breathe, didn't feed, but something deep inside him, the part of him that knew the world wasn't as simple as it seemed, knew the truth. This house had a hunger, and it had been feeding for years. His eyes flicked back to the compartment, to the decayed hand that lay before him. It looked like it had been there for decades, a forgotten relic of something that had once been human. The dark skin was cracked, and the fingers curled unnaturally as though they were reaching for something, reaching for him. David's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it deafening in the oppressive silence of the attic. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know where to turn. But one thing was certain. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. He had to get out. He had to leave before the house claimed him too. But the moment he turned to leave, he froze. The scratching sound returned. It was louder this time, closer. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. No, it was something else, something behind him. He turned around slowly, his body trembling, his feet rooted to the floor as though the very air had become thick with dread. And then he saw it. It was standing in the corner of the attic, a dark figure draped in tattered shadows, its face hidden beneath a hood. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It was as if it had always been there, waiting, watching. David couldn't make out any distinct features, only the shape of it, tall, thin, and impossibly still. The figure didn't speak, but David could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the attic with a sense of malevolent hunger. It was as if the figure was the house, as if it was made from the same decaying foundation, the same walls that pressed in on him. David took a step back, his heart pounding louder now, each beat a drum of fear in his chest. The figure didn't move, but David could feel it, feel the pull, the weight of it, pressing against him. His feet refused to move. The air was thick with something dark, something ancient. The house was feeding, and now it wanted him. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, his tongue thick in his mouth. No sound came out. His limbs felt like lead, his body stiff with terror. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body betrayed him. The figure in the corner didn't move, but David could feel it closing in on him, drawing closer with every passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. It didn't retreat, didn't fade. It simply disappeared, like a puff of smoke, leaving behind only the heavy, suffocating silence. David's chest heaved with frantic breaths, his body trembling violently now. What the hell was that? What was that thing? And why had it just disappeared? The scratching had stopped. The silence in the attic was almost unbearable. And then he heard it again, the faintest sound, almost like whispering, coming from the dark corners of the room. David's eyes darted to the journal on the floor. The pages were still open, the words haunting him, lingering in the corners of his mind. The house is hungry, they had said. The smell of death is the first sign. But there was something else in the journal, something he had barely noticed before, written in a frenzied hand, almost as if the writer had been running out of time. Do not let it take you. Do not wait for the seventh night. David blinked, his mind racing. The seventh night. He didn't understand. It was only his third night here. But the longer he stayed, the more he felt it. The weight of the house's hunger, the way it was growing stronger with each passing hour. He had to leave. He had to get out, now. There was no time to waste. His feet finally obeyed him, moving swiftly toward the attic door. But as he reached for the doorknob, his hand froze. The air in the hallway outside the attic door had grown thick, heavy, with a suffocating weight. The smell was back, stronger now, more pungent, like something was rotting just beyond the door. David's skin crawled, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The hallway, once dimly lit, now seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him, the shadows growing deeper, more menacing. And then he heard it, a voice, low, guttural, like something not quite human. Don't go. You're mine. The whisper echoed through his head, like a warning, like a promise. It was coming from the walls, from the floorboards beneath his feet, from the very air that surrounded him. David's pulse quickened. The door was right there, just within reach. He didn't know if he could escape. He didn't know if he wanted to. The whispering continued, louder now, more insistent. You can't escape. David stepped back from the door, his legs shaking, his breathing erratic. He wasn't sure if he could make it out of this house alive. He wasn't sure if he'd ever leave. The house had already begun to claim him, already wrapped its cold, invisible fingers around his soul. And as he looked toward the attic stairs, he realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't the only one who had ever tried to escape. The house had claimed others before him, and the house would continue to feed until it had devoured every last drop of fear and terror. David swallowed hard. He didn't have much time. It was already too late. David stood at the edge of the attic stairs, his body trembling with terror, his mind a frantic blur. The house felt like a living, breathing thing, its walls pressing in on him, its very foundation vibrating with an unnatural energy. He could feel the presence of something lurking just beyond the threshold of his perception, a malevolent force that had been waiting for him to unravel the threads of his own fear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to fill every corner of his mind. You can't escape. You can't run from what you've awakened. He knew it was the house, or whatever had been bound to the house, the hunger, the walls that bled whispers, the figure in the shadows. It was all tied together in ways his rational mind couldn't understand. But there was one thing he knew for certain now. He couldn't leave, not anymore. The house wouldn't let him. David had to fight. He had to do something before it was too late. His eyes flicked back to the journal that had started all of this, lying discarded on the floor. His chest tightened with fear and urgency as he walked toward it, bending down to retrieve it from the dusty floorboards. The journal was thick, its pages worn with age, but there was something in it, something he had missed before. Flipping through the pages, he found the entry he'd been searching for, the one about the ritual that could satisfy the house, silence its hunger, and keep it at bay for a time. He read the words, his throat tightening as the instructions began to take shape in his mind. The ritual was simple, or so it seemed, though he suspected, deep down, that simplicity wasn't its true nature. It was a thing of darkness, a thing meant to trap the unwary, to exploit their deepest fears and desires. The house didn't want to be satisfied. It wanted to be fed. To appease the hunger, the journal read, one must give freely, offer what is most precious, what the house seeks. Do not wait for the seventh night. Perform the ritual before it can claim your soul. David felt a sick, empty void open up in his stomach. The ritual? What could it mean? What could he possibly offer? His mind spun in confusion and dread, but the whispers around him only grew louder, the pressure building until it felt like his skull might burst. And then a thought, a horrible gnawing thought. It wasn't the house that wanted his soul. It wasn't the walls or the hunger that pulsed beneath them. It was his fear. It was what the house fed on, his very fear. It had fed on the desperation of the previous owner. It had fed on the helplessness of those before him. It was feeding on him now. David's pulse raced. If fear was what it wanted, then that was what it would get. He was terrified, yes, terrified of what he had uncovered, terrified of the dark forces at play in the house, terrified that no matter what he did, he couldn't escape it. But he had something the house didn't expect. He had knowledge, and knowledge, he knew, was the first weapon in the battle against something like this. The ritual spoke of offering, but it did not specify how to offer. It only spoke of the fear of giving freely. That meant he didn't have to feed it in the way it wanted. He didn't have to let it consume him. He could fight. David took a deep, shaky breath, his mind racing. The house was alive. The hunger was real. But so was he. And as much as the house had fed on the past, it had never dealt with someone who was willing to face it, someone who had already suffered too much to be afraid anymore. He had lost everything, his wife, his children, his home, his life, his purpose, gone. There was no more fear to feed on. He had nothing left to lose. And he realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was the only way. The house had taken everything it could from him, but there was one thing left, one final thing, his mind. David closed his eyes and held the journal in his hands, taking one last, steadying breath. His thoughts, his fear, they were all his to control, and he would not let the house take them. He would not let it claim what little of him still remained. The first step was to act. The ritual, he knew, was just a trap meant to ensnare him into giving away what remained of his will. But David wasn't going to fall for it. Instead, he would make the house see what true fear was. The fear of standing up against something impossible, against something that sought to consume every ounce of his being. He turned away from the attic door. The smell of decay had intensified, suffocating, but it was no longer the thing that drove him. It was the house's hunger, and now he would give it what it wanted. Without another thought, David moved quickly, his feet pounding against the old floorboards as he made his way down the stairs. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of the house pressing against his back, could hear the faint scratching and whispering, but he refused to listen. The walls were alive, yes, but they were not invincible. They had been built by humans, mortals, just like him. And if they had been built, they could be torn down. He reached the main floor and grabbed the first thing he saw, a broken chair, its legs splintered and warped. Without thinking, he turned it over, using the jagged wood as a weapon. "You can't stop me," he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. The whispers grew louder, but David didn't care. He had made his choice. He was done running. In that moment, he realized he wasn't alone. The dark figure from the attic appeared before him, its silhouette a silhouette of shadows, its eyes glowing faintly like smoldering embers. "You are mine," it whispered, but this time it sounded weak. It wasn't the same thing anymore. The house had underestimated him. "You cannot fight this." David lifted the broken chair above his head, his muscles taut with anger. The house had broken him before, but now it would see what real fear was. Not the fear of being consumed, but the fear of fighting back. And David was ready. David's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he stood, poised with the broken chair held high above his head. The dark figure that had appeared before him in the shadows of the room was now closer, its presence suffocating. Every inch of the house seemed to pulse with life, the walls vibrating with an unnatural energy. The air had thickened, and with it the smell of decay, a pungent, rot-filled odor that clogged his throat and made his eyes burn, was nearly unbearable. The figure, draped in the same hooded black cloak, didn't move. It was still, yet somehow it was more terrifying than anything David had faced so far. Its presence was all-consuming, and he could feel the weight of it pressing against him. But David did not falter. He would not give in. Not this time. The house had tried to take him. It had clawed at his mind, feeding on his fear, trying to consume everything that he was. But in the end, it was fear that had made him stronger. His grief, his loss, those were the things that had fueled him, the things that had broken him. But he had rebuilt himself, and now, standing in the very heart of this wretched place, he knew he had one last choice to make. "Get away from me," David said, his voice a hoarse whisper, but it was strong, stronger than he'd ever been. "I won't let you win." The figure shifted, just barely, and for a moment David thought it might strike. But instead, a deep, hollow laugh echoed in the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the laugh of something ancient, something beyond mortal understanding. The sound crawled beneath David's skin, cold and chilling. It felt like it was coming from the walls, from the very floor beneath him, from the house itself. "You think you can escape it?" The voice came, not from the figure, but from the walls around him. It was everywhere, impossible to ignore. "You cannot outrun what's already inside of you." David's grip on the chair tightened, his knuckles white. The house's hunger wasn't just for fear, he realized. It was for despair. It was for that final, fragile thread of hope that everyone eventually gave up on. The thing that twisted inside every person when they felt like the world had taken everything from them. The thing that broke them. He had almost given in. He had almost let that despair consume him, just as the house wanted. But now, standing in defiance, David understood. The house wanted his spirit. It wanted the last shred of him, the part of him that still believed in life, in something beyond the pain. But it wasn't going to get it. David took a step forward, lowering the chair with his hands trembling but resolute. His heart beat faster, his pulse pounding in his ears. The whispering from the walls grew louder, the scraping sound like nails against a chalkboard. But David forced himself to ignore it. He couldn't let fear take him. He couldn't let the house win. The figure in the corner seemed to shift, its form becoming more fluid, more formless. It stretched, its edges blurring like smoke, and in that moment David knew what it was. It was not one thing, but many. It was the house itself, the manifestation of all the darkness, the grief, the souls that had been consumed before him. David's voice rang out, clear and defiant. "I am not afraid of you." The figure recoiled, as if struck by the force of his words. The laughter stopped, replaced by a terrible silence. The air in the room seemed to crackle with energy, and David's chest tightened as the weight of the house's presence pressed down on him. But he stood tall. He would not kneel. He would not bend. With a strength he hadn't known he still had, David lunged forward. The broken chair splintered in his grip, but he didn't care. The shards of wood pierced the air as he swung it toward the walls. The house shuddered, groaned, the entire structure seeming to pulse with a terrible energy, as if it were trying to shake him loose. For a moment, David thought it was over. He thought the walls would close in on him, that the darkness would swallow him whole. But then the unexpected happened. The walls, those very walls that had been scratching, whispering, feeding, began to crack. Tiny fractures appeared in the drywall, spidering outward in every direction. A deep, unnatural groan filled the air as the house seemed to shift, the very foundations of the building rattling beneath his feet. The floorboards creaked, the beams above him groaned, and David's heart thundered in his chest as he realized that the house, this house, was falling apart. The figure in the corner shrieked, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something in between. It wasn't a scream, but a howl of rage, as if it were being torn apart from within. The shadows that had once clung to its form dissolved, and in their place the house seemed to come alive, the very walls quivering in agony. David backed away, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. The house was fighting back. It was trying to survive, but it wasn't going to win this time. He turned and ran, no longer caring about the figure, no longer caring about the whispers or the smell of decay. The house was collapsing. The walls were shaking, splintering, as if everything that had been trapped within, everything that had been waiting for him, was being destroyed in an instant. As he reached the front door, he turned to look back one last time. The house was already beginning to crumble. The walls had cracked wide open, the floor had split, and through the jagged openings, David could see the dark nothingness beyond, the hunger that had driven the house to feed on him, on everyone who had ever stepped foot inside. But now it was done. David didn't wait to see the final collapse. He pushed the door open, stumbling out into the night. The smell of decay still clung to his clothes, to his skin, but for the first time in what felt like forever, David felt the cool air on his face. He wasn't free yet, but he was alive in a way that the house would never be again. The house was gone, torn apart by its own hunger. It had tried to consume him, to swallow him whole, but it had underestimated him. David didn't look back as he walked away from the ruins of his former home. He had fought back against the darkness, and for the first time in years, he felt like he might just have a chance to start over. The past had tried to consume him, but he had survived, and that was enough.